Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The house was beautiful during the day. Wide open spaces, trees all around, enough room for me to run around and explore. But at night, it felt like we were being watched. I know how that sounds, believe me. I've spent nearly 40 years trying to rationalize what happened that summer, but I can't. Some things just don't have a rational explanation. It started with footsteps. Not the regular kind. These were heavy, deliberate. The first time I heard them, I was lying in bed, probably around 10 p.m. My room was on the ground floor, with a window facing the woods. I remember it was a particularly humid night, typical Oklahoma summer weather. The window was slightly open to let in whatever breeze might come through. At first, I thought it was my dad doing a final check around the property. He did that sometimes, especially since we were so new to the place. But these footsteps, they were different. Slower, heavier. The way they made the ground crunch under them, it wasn't normal. I remember lying there completely still, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or maybe a stray cow from one of the neighboring farms. Then the smell hit me. If you've ever driven past roadkill on a hot summer day, multiply that by 10 and add something different, something musky and wild. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I pulled my blanket up to my nose, trying to block it out, but it just kept getting stronger. That's when I saw it. Well, not it exactly, but its shadow. The security light Dad had installed cast this massive silhouette through my window. Whatever it was, it had to be at least 8 feet tall. I remember thinking how weird the shape looked, like a person, but wrong. The proportions were off. The shoulders were too wide, the arms too long. I wanted to scream, to call for my parents, but I couldn't make a sound. I just lay there, paralyzed, watching this huge shadow move past my window. The footsteps were so close now I could feel slight vibrations in my bed. Then it stopped, right outside my window. I could hear breathing, deep, heavy breaths that seemed to echo in the quiet night. My brother Tom was home from college that week, thank God. He was staying in the guest room across the hall. I didn't know it then, but he was awake too, experiencing the same thing. We didn't talk about it until the next morning. When he brought it up at breakfast, I nearly choked on my cereal. "Did you hear something walking around last night?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in his voice. Dad dismissed it, of course. Said it was probably just wildlife getting used to us being there. Mom looked worried but didn't say anything. But Tom and I knew. We'd both seen it, both smelled that awful stench. The next few nights were quiet, almost suspiciously so. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, just this heavy silence that seemed to press down on the house. Then came the night that changed everything. It was about a week after the first incident. I'd finally started to relax a little, convince myself it was just my imagination running wild. I was reading some comics in bed with my flashlight, probably around 11 p.m. Mom and Dad were asleep upstairs, and Tom was still up watching TV in the living room. The first warning was the dogs. We had 2 German shepherds that slept in the garage, and they suddenly started going absolutely crazy. Not their regular barking at raccoons or possums. This was different. They sounded terrified. Then they just stopped, mid-bark. The silence that followed was worse than the barking. That's when I heard it. Heavy footsteps circling the house, slower than before, more deliberate. The security light kept flickering on and off as something massive moved around the property. I could hear branches snapping under its weight. The smell came back, stronger than ever. Then the knocking started, Not on my window this time, but on the walls of the house. Deep, powerful thuds that made the whole structure vibrate. It wasn't like someone knocking to get attention. It was more like something testing the strength of our walls. I heard Tom's TV shut off and his footsteps rushing down the hall. He burst into my room just as the biggest thud yet shook the house. "Get down!" he yelled, pulling me off the bed. We crouched in the corner, and that's when it happened. The window exploded inward, not from something pushing through, but from a log, a whole damn tree trunk, being thrown through it. Glass went everywhere. The log was at least 8 inches thick and had to weigh hundreds of pounds. The force it took to throw it like that, it's impossible to even think about. The sound of the crash brought our parents running downstairs. Dad had his shotgun. Mum was already on the phone with the police. But over all the chaos, I heard it. This sound, not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something in between. It was so loud it made my ears ring, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The police came, of course. They took pictures, wrote reports, asked questions. They found huge footprints in the mud, 18 inches long at least. They also found broken branches on trees 12 feet up, snapped like twigs. The official report said it was probably vandals, but we all knew better. No human could have done what we saw that night. Dad installed metal bars on all the ground floor windows the next day. We got more security lights, motion sensors, the works, but it didn't matter. I couldn't sleep in that room anymore. For the rest of that summer, I stayed at friends' houses as much as I could. When I did sleep at home, it was in the upstairs guest room. The strange thing is, after that night with the log, the incidents mostly stopped. We'd occasionally hear those heavy footsteps in the distance, or catch that awful smell on the wind, but whatever it was seemed to lose interest in us. Or maybe it had made its point. Tom went back to college a few weeks later, and I never felt safe in that house again. We moved away the following year. Dad said it was for his job, but I think he knew none of us felt right there anymore. I've tried researching similar incidents in that area since then. There have been other reports, not many, but enough to make me feel less crazy, all describing the same things: the footsteps, the smell, the strange knocking on walls, but none as violent as what we experienced. I know what you're probably thinking, that I was just a kid with an overactive imagination. That's what I tried to tell myself for years, but I've got a photo that proves at least part of it. After the police left, I took a picture of one of the footprints before Dad filled it in. It's faded now, yellowed with age, but you can still make out the massive impression in the mud, nearly twice the size of my dad's boot print next to it for scale. I don't go around telling this story much. Most people don't believe it, and I get that. I probably wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't lived through it. But sometimes, late at night, when I hear something heavy walking outside my house, or catch a whiff of something that reminds me of that awful smell I remember, and I wonder if it's still out there, in those Oklahoma woods, watching and waiting. That summer changed me. It showed me that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that don't fit into our neat, rational boxes. I still don't know what it was that terrorized our family that summer. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it was real. It was intelligent, and it wanted us to know we weren't welcome there. Sometimes I think about driving back to Bristow, finding our old property, seeing if there's any trace left of what happened there. But then I remember that sound it made, that impossible raw scream, and I decide some memories are better left in the past. Whatever it was that visited us that summer, I hope it stays in those woods where it belongs. Story 2. It was early July, and the New Mexico heat was brutal, even up in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. My best friend Bob and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd done all the preparatory hikes, gotten our gear sorted out, and thought we were ready for anything. Man, were we wrong. The day it happened started like any other at Philmont. We'd been there about a week, and our group was doing a challenging trail that wound through some pretty dense forest. It was me, Bob, and 2 other scouts from our troop, Mike and Tom. Our scout leader had stayed back at base camp that morning because of a twisted ankle, but we were experienced enough that he trusted us on the marked trails. The weird stuff started around 2 p.m. We'd been hiking for about 4 hours, taking it easy, stopping to look at interesting plants and rocks, typical scout stuff. The first thing that caught my attention was the silence. If you've spent any time in the woods, you know there's always some kind of background noise, birds, insects, wind in the trees, but suddenly everything just stopped. It was like someone had hit the mute button on the forest. I remember looking at Bob, and he had this strange expression on his face. Before either of us could say anything, we caught this smell. Look, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania. I know what bears smell like, what rotting animals smell like. This was different. It was this intense, musky odor, kind of like wet dog mixed with something worse, something I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. That's when we heard the first branch snap. It wasn't like the normal sounds you hear when deer move through the woods. This was loud, like someone breaking a baseball bat. It came from about 30-35 yards to our left, up a slight incline in the trees. Mike was the first one to spot it. I'll never forget the way his face just drained of color. He didn't scream or shout. He just pointed and started backing up. When I turned to look, my whole world shifted. Standing there, partially hidden behind a large pine tree, was something that had no business existing. It was huge. I mean, huge. Maybe 8 feet tall, but it was hard to tell exactly because of the way it was positioned. The thing that struck me most was how black it was, not brown like a bear, but this deep, almost blue-black color. The fur looked thick and matted in some places, especially around what I guess you'd call its shoulders. But its face, God, its face. It wasn't like the cute Bigfoot cartoons you see on beef jerky packages. This thing had a face that looked almost ancient, like something that had been walking these woods long before humans ever showed up. Its eyes were dark, but I could see them moving, studying us with what I can only describe as intelligence. Mike and Tom didn't stick around. They took off running back down the trail, and I don't blame them. But Bob and I, we were frozen. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was fascination, but we just stood there, staring at this impossible thing, and it stared right back. The creature didn't make any aggressive moves. It just watched us for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds or so. Then it simply stepped back and seemed to melt into the forest. The crazy thing is, despite its size, it moved almost silently. The only sound was another branch snap, this time farther away. Bob and I eventually made it back to camp, meeting up with Mike and Tom, who had already told everyone about seeing a bear. We didn't correct them. Something told us to keep quiet about what we'd really seen. I wish we had. That night, Bob and I were in our tent, trying to make sense of what had happened. We had our field guides out, even though we knew damn well what we saw wasn't going to be in any official scout handbook. It was around 11 p.m., and most of the camp was quiet. That's when we heard it. Heavy footsteps, moving through the camp. Not sneaking, just walking, like it had every right to be there. The footsteps stopped right outside our tent. I could see the shadow through the tent fabric, a massive, upright figure. Bob reached for his flashlight, and I wanted to stop him, but I wasn't quick enough. What happened next still gives me nightmares. When that beam of light hit the tent wall, the shadow moved. Bob screamed, and I mean screamed. It wasn't a normal scream of fear. It was primal, like something deep in his brain recognized a predator our ancestors used to fear. The sound echoed through the entire camp, probably waking everyone within a mile. The creature took off, and this time it wasn't being quiet. We could hear it crashing through the underbrush, breaking branches as it went. The whole camp erupted into chaos. Flashlights started coming on everywhere. People were yelling, and within minutes the rangers showed up with their trucks. What happened next was almost as strange as seeing the creature itself. While the rangers were still searching the area, these three men showed up. They were wearing suits, freaking suits, up here in the wilderness. They looked like something out of a government office, completely out of place in a scout camp. They took Bob and me aside and spent almost an hour trying to convince us that we had seen a bear. They had this whole presentation ready, showing us pictures of bears standing on their hind legs, explaining how fear can make you see things differently in the dark. They were calm, professional, and absolutely full of it. I knew what I saw, both during the day and at night. That was no bear. Bears don't walk through camps on two legs. Bears don't have that kind of presence, that kind of intelligence in their eyes. And bears definitely don't make you feel like you're looking at something that shouldn't exist in the modern world. The men in suits made us sign some papers, some kind of statement about the bear sighting. They were very insistent about the wording. Looking back, I wish I'd kept a copy, but at 15, you do what adults tell you to do. The strange thing is, after that night, nothing else happened. The rest of our time at Philmont was completely normal. No more sightings, no more weird noises, no more mysterious smells. It was like whatever had been watching us had made its point and moved on. Bob and I didn't talk about it much after that. What was there to say? We knew what we saw, but we also knew that telling the story would only make us sound crazy. Mike and Tom stuck to their bear story, and eventually that became the official version of events. But here's the thing that still bothers me 40 years later. Those men in suits knew something. They showed up too quickly, were too prepared with their explanation. It was like they'd done this before, like they had a standard procedure for dealing with people who saw things they weren't supposed to see. I've spent a lot of time in the outdoors since then. I've seen bears, mountain lions, all sorts of wildlife. Nothing has ever come close to what I saw that day at Philmont. Nothing has ever given me that same feeling of being in the presence of something ancient and intelligent, something that was merely tolerating our presence in its territory. Sometimes I think about going back to Philmont, trying to find that exact spot on the trail. But then I remember Bob's scream, that primal sound of pure terror, and I decide maybe some mysteries are better left unexplored. I still can't explain why it chose to reveal itself to us that day, or why it visited our tent that night. Was it curiosity? A warning? A reminder that there are still things in this world that we can't explain? All I know is that whatever I saw that summer in New Mexico wasn't supposed to exist. But it does. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there, still watching hikers from behind the trees, still choosing when and to whom it shows itself. Story 3. I've kept quiet about this for almost 40 years now, but what happened during that summer at the church camp in Muldrow still haunts me. I was 23 then, working as a counselor at the Baptist youth camp just outside town. It was my second year there, and nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that July. The camp itself was pretty typical: a main lodge, several cabins spread out among the pines, and separate bathroom facilities about 50 yards from the sleeping areas. We had about 60 kids that session, mostly 12-14-year-olds, split between boys' and girls' cabins. I was one of 8 counselors, responsible for supervising activities and keeping everyone safe. Looking back, I realize how utterly unprepared we were for what we faced. It started on a Tuesday evening. The weather had been unusually cool for July in Oklahoma, hovering around 75 degrees with this weird fog that kept rolling in from the woods. I remember being on night duty, doing my rounds at about 9:30 p.m., when I first noticed something was off. The usual chorus of crickets and tree frogs just stopped. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the forest. Even the wind seemed to die down. I was walking past the girls' bathroom building when I heard the first scream. It wasn't one of those playful screams you usually hear at camp. This was pure terror. I sprinted toward the building, flashlight bouncing wildly. 2 girls from cabin 3 came running out, one of them crying hysterically, the other trying to pull her along faster. Sarah, the crying one, could barely speak, but Jenny, the other girl, grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. "There's something at the window," she kept saying. "It was looking in at us. It was huge." I tried to calm them down, but Jenny was dead serious. "Mr. David, I swear to God, there was this massive face in the window. It had to be like 8 feet up. It wasn't human. It had this dark hair all over it and these eyes." She started shaking just describing it. I immediately radioed Tom, our head counselor, and within minutes we had the whole camp on alert. The girls were escorted back to their cabins, and we did a perimeter check. That's when we found the first evidence that something wasn't right. The bathroom window was about 7 feet off the ground, and below it, pressed into the soft dirt, was a footprint unlike anything I'd ever seen. It had to be 16 inches long at least, deeply impressed into the ground, like whatever made it was incredibly heavy. The next morning, we contacted the local police. Officer Martinez came out with his German Shepherd, Rex, one of those highly trained K9 units. I'll never forget what happened next. Rex took one sniff of the area around the footprint and just changed. This was a dog I'd seen track down missing hikers, but he started whining and backing away, his tail tucked between his legs. When Martinez tried to get him to track the scent, Rex bolted straight back to the patrol car and refused to come out. I'd never seen anything like it, and Martinez admitted he hadn't either. We had to implement new safety protocols immediately. No one was allowed to go to the bathrooms alone. We set up a buddy system and had counselors posted at all times. We also installed temporary floodlights around the buildings. But the thing is, whatever was out there seemed to get bolder. That night, around 2 a.m., I was on watch with Sarah, another counselor, when we heard this sound that I still have trouble describing. It was like a cross between a deep growl and what almost sounded like speech, but not quite human. It came from the tree line, maybe 100 yards out. The floodlights didn't reach that far, but I swear I saw movement. Something massive moving between the trees. The really unsettling part was the smell that came with it. Anyone who spent time in the woods knows the usual smells: moss, decay, animal musk. This was different. It was this overwhelming putrid odor, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog, but so strong it made your eyes water. It would come in waves, and you could almost track the creature's movement by following the smell. Over the next few days, we found more evidence. Broken branches 8 feet up on trees, more footprints, and these weird structures made of twisted saplings that definitely weren't natural. Some of the younger kids started talking about seeing a giant monkey watching them during daytime activities, always just at the edge of the woods. The camp director wanted to keep things quiet to avoid panic, but word got out. Parents started calling, and we had to modify all our outdoor activities. No more night hikes, no campfire stories in the outdoor amphitheater. We kept everyone close to the main buildings after sunset. The final incident happened on Friday night. I was doing a final check of the girls' bathroom before lights out. We'd started locking it at night and only opening it with counselor supervision. I heard this heavy breathing outside, and then this shadow fell across the window. I froze. Whatever it was massive enough to completely block the security light we'd installed outside. I still remember the sound of its hand, if you could call it that, pressing against the window. The glass actually flexed inward slightly from the pressure. I stood there, paralyzed, as this dark, hairy figure shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of its face. The eyes are what stay with me. They weren't animal eyes, but they weren't human either. There was an intelligence there, something that seemed to be studying me as much as I was studying it. The whole encounter probably lasted only 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. Then, something in the woods made a noise, probably a deer, and it turned its head suddenly. In one fluid motion, it moved away from the window, and I heard heavy footsteps quickly fading into the forest. We closed the camp early that session. The official story was that we had plumbing issues, but the real reason was that we couldn't guarantee anyone's safety. The local police filed a report, but nothing ever came of it. Some people suggested it was just a bear, but I've encountered bears before. This was something else entirely. I've never been able to explain what happened that week. The few times I've tried to talk about it, people either think I'm exaggerating or just making it up entirely. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know what I felt. There was something intelligent out there in those woods, something that was watching us, studying us. The footprints and the broken branches were real. The terror in those girls' eyes was real. The way that police dog reacted was real. I still live in Oklahoma, but I've never gone back to Muldrow. Sometimes when I'm having trouble sleeping, I'll find myself thinking about those eyes at the window and that deep, almost human sound from the woods. Whatever it was, it showed enough intelligence to stay just out of reach of our lights, to know when to appear and when to withdraw. That's what scares me the most. Not that it was some mindless beast, but that it seemed to be studying us, learning our patterns, testing our defenses. The camp still operates today, but they've renovated it completely, tore down the old bathrooms and built new ones attached to the cabins. I've often wondered if that was a coincidence, or if something else happened there after we left. Either way, I know what I encountered that summer, even if I can't explain exactly what it was. Some things just defy explanation, and maybe it's better that way. Those woods hold secrets, and sometimes late at night, I wonder if that creature is still out there, watching and waiting from the shadows of the tree line, just like it did all those years ago. Story 4. It's been over 30 years, but I still can't shake what happened that night in Salisa. I had just returned from my stint in the army, feeling pretty confident about life in general. You know how it is when you're young and think you've seen it all? Well, that summer of 1990 proved me dead wrong. My dad and I had this little routine going. Every evening we'd sit out on the front porch of our house just outside town, watching the sun set over the tree line. Dad would smoke his pipe, and I'd nurse a beer, catching up on all the time I'd missed while serving. It was peaceful, you know, just two guys enjoying each other's company without having to say much. Our property backed up against about 200 acres of dense woodland. Dad had lived there for nearly 20 years and knew every trail and creek like the back of his hand. Being a photographer, he'd spent countless hours in those woods capturing wildlife shots. He was the skeptical type, always looking for logical explanations for everything. If someone claimed they saw something strange in those woods, he'd be the first to debunk it with some rational explanation. It was our 5th or 6th night of doing this porch routine when everything changed. The air was thick with humidity, typical Oklahoma summer evening. Must have been around 9:30 p.m., and the woods were alive with the usual chorus of crickets and frogs. I remember checking my watch because I was thinking about heading in soon. That's when we heard it. The sound started low, almost like a deep breath, but then it built into something I can't really describe properly. It was like a roar, but not like any animal I'd ever heard, and I'd heard plenty of bears and big cats during training exercises. This was different. It was powerful enough that I felt it in my chest, like when you're standing too close to a speaker at a concert. But it wasn't just loud. It had this quality to it, almost like it was meant to be heard for miles. I've heard people compare it to the Ohio Grassman recording, but honestly, this was worse. Much worse. It had this almost human quality to it, but distorted, like someone had taken a human voice and made it 10 times bigger and deeper. What really got to me wasn't just the sound, it was my dad's reaction. I looked over at him, and I'll never forget what I saw. His pipe had dropped from his mouth onto his lap, tobacco scattered everywhere, and he hadn't even noticed. His face had gone completely white. In all my years, I had never seen my father look scared. Concerned, worried, sure, but not scared. Not like this. The sound echoed through the trees for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 15 seconds. Then everything went silent. And I mean silent. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the whole forest. Dad finally moved, slowly picking up his pipe with shaking hands. "David," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "in 20 years of walking these woods, I've never heard anything like that." Coming from him, that meant something. This was a man who could identify any animal sound in Oklahoma without hesitation. We sat there for another hour, barely speaking, just listening. The normal forest sounds gradually returned, but something felt different, like the woods themselves had changed somehow. The next morning, Dad went into town and bought a Remington 308. This was a man who had never owned anything more powerful than a .22 for rabbits. When he got home, he handed me the rifle and said, "I need you to find out what made that sound." I spent the next few days scouting the woods. The area where we thought the sound came from was about half a mile into the trees. I found some strange signs. Broken branches way too high up for a bear, about 8 feet off the ground. There were areas where the underbrush had been pushed down, creating paths that weren't there before. But the thing that really got to me was the smell. It hit me on the second day of searching. I was checking out one of these newly made paths when this overwhelming stench stopped me in my tracks. It was like a combination of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I can't even describe. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. I've been around dead bodies in the service. I know what decay smells like. This was different. Then I found the prints. They were in a muddy area near the creek, partially filled with water but still visible. I'm no tracker, but I know human footprints, and I know bear prints. These weren't either. They were huge, must have been 16 inches long at least, and they showed 5 distinct toes. The stride length between them was incredible, easily over 6 feet. I took photos with Dad's camera, but when we developed them later, they came out blurry and inconclusive. Typical, right? But I measured them with my hunting knife and marked the measurements in my notebook. I still have those notes somewhere in my garage. What happened next still gives me nightmares. I was following the tracks along the creek when that silence fell again. You know how they say animals can sense danger before humans? Well, everything just stopped. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. The air felt heavy, like right before a storm. I had the rifle ready, but my hands were shaking so bad I'm not sure I could have hit anything. That's when I heard something moving through the trees behind me, not making any effort to be quiet, breaking branches, crushing undergrowth. Whatever it was big, and it was moving fast. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. Through the trees, about 50 yards away, something massive was moving. It was covered in dark brown hair, and it was tall, way tall. I'm 6'2", and this thing would have towered over me. It moved behind a large oak tree, and I swear to God that tree must have been 3 feet wide, but it didn't completely hide behind it. For a split second it looked right at me. I know it saw me because it stopped moving completely. Its face, I only got a glimpse, but it was like looking at something that was almost human, but not quite. The eyes were what got me. They were dark, intelligent, and they were filled with what I can only describe as anger. I'd like to say I stood my ground or tried to get a shot off, but that would be a lie. I ran. I ran faster than I ever did in basic training. I could hear it moving parallel to me through the woods, keeping pace easily. It could have caught me if it wanted to. I'm sure of that now. But it didn't. It was escorting me out of its territory. When I burst out of the tree line into our backyard, Dad was on the porch with his camera. He must have heard me coming. He took a few shots, but like the footprint photos, they didn't show much, just a blur of movement in the trees. We never heard that roar again, though sometimes at night we'd hear wood knocking sounds from deep in the forest. Dad stopped doing his wildlife photography in those woods. He still went out during the day for landscape shots, but never alone and never near dusk. I've told this story a few times over the years, usually after a few drinks when someone brings up crazy experiences. Most people don't believe me, and I don't blame them. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't lived it. Dad passed away in 2012, and before he died, he made me promise to keep the rifle. It's still in my gun safe, though I've never had to use it. I've researched similar encounters over the years, and I've found a few reports from that area of Oklahoma that describe something similar, but nothing quite matches what we experienced that summer. Sometimes I drive by our old house. New family lives there now, and look at those woods. They look the same as they always did, but I know better. Something's in there. Something that doesn't want to be found, but isn't afraid to let you know it's there. I don't go into those woods anymore. Some places, I've learned, are better left alone. Story 5. It was early October in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. The weather had just started to turn, with that crisp autumn feel in the air that makes you want to be outside. I had planned this weekend trip with my sons, James, 15, and Michael, 13, weeks in advance. We'd been exploring the wooded areas around Broken Arrow for years. It was our thing, our father-son's bonding time. I knew those woods like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. We headed out early that morning, around 7 a.m. The plan was to explore some of the less traveled areas south of the city, near where the terrain gets a bit rougher. The boys were in high spirits. James had just gotten his learner's permit and couldn't stop talking about driving, while Michael was excited about using his new digital camera he'd gotten for his birthday. The morning started normally enough. We parked our truck at one of the old logging road entrances and grabbed our day packs. I always made sure we were prepared: water bottles, trail mix, first aid kit, flashlights, and a satellite phone for emergencies. Living in Oklahoma, you learn to respect nature and come prepared. About 2 hours into our hike, we started noticing something odd. The usual morning bird calls had gotten quieter, which isn't normal for that time of day. I've spent enough time in these woods to know when something feels off, and the hair on the back of my neck was starting to stand up. The boys didn't notice at first. They were too busy arguing about some video game. We came to a clearing where the ground was softer due to recent rain, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought I was seeing things. A footprint, but not like anything I'd ever seen before. It was fresh, the edges still sharp in the soft mud. Must have been made within the last hour or so. It was huge, easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. I've tracked deer, bear, and every other animal in these woods, but this was different. I called the boys over, and James immediately pulled out his phone to take pictures. Michael stood there, just staring at it. "Dad," he whispered, "that's not a bear print, is it?" The fear in his voice made my stomach turn. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking as I took measurements with a stick. The print was nearly twice the size of my boot. That's when we heard it. A crack of branches somewhere in the dense forest to our left. Not like a deer moving through brush. This was heavy, deliberate. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just that oppressive silence that makes your ears ring. I motioned for the boys to stay still. Years of hunting had taught me that movement draws attention. But the silence was broken by something that still haunts my dreams. a smell. Not like a dead animal or anything natural. It was a thick, musty odor, like wet dog mixed with something rotting. Michael gagged, and James covered his nose with his shirt. We started backing away slowly, trying to retrace our steps. That's when we saw it. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, was something that shouldn't exist. A massive figure, at least 7 feet tall, covered in brown fur. Its face was a greyish colour, almost like old leather, with deep-set eyes that looked intelligent. God help me, they looked intelligent. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was built like a gorilla, but stood upright like a human. Its shoulders must have been twice as wide as mine, and I'm not a small man. Then it happened. The creature let out a scream that I can only describe as a mix between a woman's shriek and a bear's roar. It was so loud it seemed to vibrate in my chest. I've never heard anything like it before or since. The sound scared it as much as it scared us. I could see it flinch at its own voice. That's when everything went to hell. James, my level-headed smart kid who I'd taught everything about wildlife safety, just ran. 15 years of teaching him to stay calm, to never run from predators, gone in an instant of pure panic. He bolted straight back toward the truck, crashing through the underbrush like a scared deer. "James, stop!" I screamed, but it was too late. Michael was frozen beside me, trembling so hard I could hear his teeth chattering. The creature moved. Dear God, it moved so fast for something so big. It took 2 massive steps forward, and I could see its muscles rippling under that brown fur. I grabbed Michael's arm and started backing away slowly, trying to keep my eyes on it while moving toward where James had run. The creature screamed again, and this time I saw its face clearly, nostrils flaring, showing teeth that looked too human and too animal at the same time. It beat its chest once, not like a gorilla in the movies, but more like a person trying to show dominance. The sound was like someone hitting a bass drum. We kept backing away, and I noticed something that still bothers me to this day. It was letting us leave. It could have easily caught us if it wanted to, but it stayed at that distance, watching, almost like it was making sure we were leaving its territory. The walk back to the truck was the longest 20 minutes of my life. We found James there, hyperventilating, tears streaming down his face. He'd run the entire way without stopping. Michael hadn't said a word since we'd seen the creature, and he didn't speak during the entire drive home. That night, none of us slept. James had scratches all over his arms and face from running through the brush. Michael threw up twice. I sat in my study, trying to convince myself that what we'd seen had a rational explanation, but I knew better. The next day, I called in sick to work, and the boys stayed home from school. We tried to talk about it, but words failed us. How do you process something that shouldn't exist? I wanted to go back, to look for evidence, to prove to myself that it was real or that I was crazy. But one look at my boys' faces told me that wasn't an option. James gave up Boy Scouts the next week. Michael sold his camera. Neither of them would go anywhere near the woods after that. They're grown men now, with families of their own, but they still won't go camping or hiking. James moved to Chicago, says he likes being surrounded by concrete. Michael stayed in Oklahoma but won't let his kids play in the wooded lot behind his house. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened that day. I've read every book, every article I could find about Sasquatch sightings. Some nights, I still wake up hearing that scream, smelling that awful odor. I've never gone back to that specific spot, though I've thought about it countless times. The thing that stays with me most isn't the size of the creature, or its speed, or even that terrifying scream. It's the eyes. Those weren't the eyes of an animal. There was something in them, awareness, intelligence, maybe even fear. It was as scared of us as we were of it, and that somehow makes it worse. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told it to me before that day, I would have thought they were crazy or lying. But I know what we saw. Those woods held something that science says shouldn't exist, something that changed our lives forever. My boys haven't spoken about it since that day, and I respect that. Some experiences are too big, too impossible to process. Every October, when the air gets that same crisp feel, I think about going back, about trying to find proof, about facing whatever it was we saw that day. But then I remember the look in my son's eyes, the pure terror that changed them from outdoor-loving kids into men who won't step foot in a forest, and I stay home. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, there are days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what we saw that day in Broken Arrow. I know that somewhere in those woods, something exists that shouldn't, something that watches and waits and screams. And maybe that's enough. Knowing that there are still mysteries in this world, things that can't be explained away with science and reason. Just don't ask my boys about it. Some wounds never really heal. Sometimes late at night I look at the pictures James took of that footprint. They're blurry. His hands were shaking too much for a clear shot, but they're real. I keep them in a locked drawer in my desk, along with the stick I used to measure the print. 16 inches, 16 impossible inches that changed everything. Story 6. I was working as a land surveyor back then, doing preliminary work for a small development project just outside Gore. It was early October, and the weather was unusually warm for that time of year. I'd been out since dawn that morning, working my way through a heavily wooded area about 3 miles east of town. The location was pretty remote, mostly old-growth forest with scattered clearings where logging had taken place years ago. Around 2 p.m., I remember checking my GPS coordinates and wiping sweat from my forehead. The humidity was brutal that day, and the air had that heavy, static feeling that usually comes before a storm. I'd been hearing distant thunder for the past hour, but the sky was still mostly clear overhead, visible through gaps in the canopy. The first thing that struck me as odd was the silence. If you've spent any time in Oklahoma forests, you know they're never truly quiet. There's always birds, insects, wind in the trees, something. But at that moment, everything just stopped. No birds, no cicadas, nothing. The silence was so sudden and complete that I actually stopped what I was doing and looked around, thinking maybe a hawk or eagle was nearby. That's when I caught that smell. Anyone who's ever worked outdoors knows the usual forest smells: decay, soil, vegetation. This was different. It was like a combination of wet dog, rotting meat, and something musky I can't even describe. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water, and it seemed to be getting stronger. I heard it before I saw it. Heavy footsteps, not like a deer or bear, and bears are rare in that part of Oklahoma anyway. These were bipedal steps, with a weight to them that made the ground vibrate slightly. They were coming from behind a dense stand of oak trees about 50 feet ahead of me. My heart was already racing when I saw the branches move. Then it stepped out, and my whole world shifted. I'm 6'2", and this thing made me feel tiny. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. The body was massive, not fat, but powerfully built, with muscles clearly visible even through the thick brown fur that covered it. The fur wasn't uniform in color. It had subtle variations, darker in some places, lighter in others, just like you'd see on a real animal. But it was the face that froze me in place. I've seen the Patterson-Gimlin film countless times since then, trying to compare what I saw to that famous footage. The basic structure was similar, that distinctive brow ridge, the flat nose, but this was no costume. The skin on its face was lighter than I expected, almost a grayish pink where the fur was thinner. Its eyes were deep-set and black, not like human eyes at all, and I could see its teeth when its mouth opened slightly. They were dark, almost yellowish-brown, like old ivory. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10-15 seconds. I couldn't move. My surveying equipment was still in my hands, but I couldn't even think about using it. My legs were shaking so bad I thought I might fall over. The thing that strikes me most, looking back, was its expression. There was intelligence there, and what looked like surprise. It seemed just as startled to see me as I was to see it. Its head tilted slightly in this eerily human gesture of curiosity, and I swear I saw its nostrils flare as it scented the air. Then something changed. I don't know if I made some small movement or if it just decided it had seen enough, but its whole demeanor shifted. Its shoulders hunched forward slightly, and it made this sound, not quite a growl, more like a deep rumbling breath that I could feel in my chest. That's when my survival instincts finally kicked in. I dropped my equipment, just let it fall right there, and backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off it. The creature watched me retreat, taking one step forward for every 3 steps I took back. Its movements were smooth, nothing like the awkward shuffle you see in hoaxed videos. Each step was deliberate, powerful. When I'd backed up maybe 30 feet, it suddenly made this sound, a cross between a deep whooping noise and what I can only describe as wood knocking against wood, but much louder than any woodpecker. The sound echoed through the trees, and to my horror, I heard a similar sound respond from somewhere off to my right, much further away. That's when I ran. I don't remember much about that sprint back to my truck, except the burning in my lungs and the sound of blood rushing in my ears. I kept expecting to hear it pursuing me, but there was nothing except my own panicked breathing and the sound of branches whipping past me. I made it back to my truck in record time, probably clearing a mile in what felt like minutes. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled out onto the dirt road, I caught a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror, something large and dark moving between the trees, but I didn't stop to get a better look. The aftermath was almost as surreal as the encounter itself. I went back the next day with 2 other surveyors to retrieve my equipment. The area felt different, normal forest sounds, no strange smells. We found my equipment right where I'd dropped it, and nearby we found footprints. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, but rain from the night before had partially filled them with water, making them less distinct than I'd hoped. One of my colleagues took photos, but they didn't capture much, just vague depressions in the mud that could be dismissed as anything. What the photos didn't show were the broken branches about 8 feet up on several trees, snapped in a way that no normal Oklahoma wildlife could manage. I've thought about this encounter every day since it happened. I've read every book I could find about Bigfoot encounters, watched every documentary, compared notes with other witnesses. Some details match up with other sightings in the area. The height, the coloring, the wood-knocking sounds. But nothing. What the photos didn't show were the broken branches about 8 feet up on several trees, snapped in a way that no normal Oklahoma wildlife could manage. I've thought about this encounter every day since it happened. I've read every book I could find about Bigfoot encounters, watched every documentary, compared notes with other witnesses. Some details match up with other sightings in the area. The height, the coloring, the wood-knocking sounds. But nothing I've read or watched quite captures the feeling of being there, of looking into those eyes and knowing you're seeing something that shouldn't exist. I still work as a surveyor, but I haven't gone back to that particular area. I've heard there have been other sightings around Gore over the years, but I've avoided looking too deeply into them. Sometimes late at night, I still wake up with that smell in my nostrils or the echo of that deep, resonant whooping sound in my ears. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told it to me before 2010, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But I know what I saw. That creature was real. It was intelligent, and it was nothing that modern science can explain. I don't know what it was doing in those woods that day, or why our paths crossed. All I know is that it changed my understanding of what's possible, and what might still be out there in the wild places of the world. I'd spend most weekends there, helping her with the property and enjoying the quiet country life. It was mid-March, and the weather was just starting to warm up. The first weird thing I noticed was how the cattle were acting. Sarah had about 24 head of cattle, and they'd always been pretty calm, but they started getting agitated for no apparent reason. They'd bunch up together in the middle of the field, even during nice weather. At first, we figured it might be coyotes, but something felt off about their behavior. They'd all face the same direction, staring at the tree line, and no amount of calling would get them to move. Then came the window incidents. It started with light tapping sounds at night, like someone throwing tiny pebbles. We'd hear it mostly on the bedroom windows on the second floor, which made no sense. There weren't any trees close enough to the house to reach that high. The first few times, I got up to check, but never saw anything, just darkness and that heavy silence that seems to press against your ears. The deer started acting strange too. We'd often see them around the property, but they began avoiding certain areas completely, particularly the northwestern corner where the woods got thicker. One morning, I found several deer tracks in the mud near the barn, but they were scattered in all directions like they'd panicked and bolted. Something had spooked them bad enough to make them break their usual paths. Sarah's Uncle Tom and Aunt Mary lived about a mile down the road. They'd been there for over 30 years, and when we mentioned the weird happenings, they exchanged this look I'll never forget. Tom just nodded slowly and said they'd had similar issues over the years. A week later, they showed up with these massive industrial floodlights. "For the bears and mountain lions," Tom said. But the way he said it, I knew he wasn't telling the whole truth. The night everything came to a head was April 12th. I remember because we'd just finished doing our taxes that afternoon. Around 8:30 p.m., we were watching TV when the power went out. Not unusual for rural Oklahoma, but then we heard this sound, like wood creaking, but much louder, followed by heavy thuds that seemed to circle the house. The cattle started making this awful racket, bellowing like I'd never heard before. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, a habit from checking on the livestock at night, and Sarah took her phone for light. The security lights were out too, which wasn't normal. They had a backup battery system. Standing on the back porch, we heard something large moving through the underbrush about 50 yards away. The sound of breaking branches was too heavy for a deer or even a bear. That's when I caught the smell, like wet dog mixed with something rotten and musty. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Sarah gripped my arm hard enough to leave marks. There, at the edge of the flashlight's beam, something moved. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, and the beam caught what looked like reddish-brown fur. But what haunts me most was its movement, smooth and deliberate, nothing like a bear. It was bipedal, walking upright with an eerily human-like gait. I raised the rifle instinctively, but Sarah whispered, "Don't." Looking back, I'm glad I listened. The figure stopped, and I swear it turned to look at us. Even though I couldn't see its face clearly, I could feel it watching. The air felt electric, like right before a storm hits. Then we heard another crash from the opposite direction. There was more than one of them. We backed into the house slowly, never turning our backs to the yard. Once inside, we heard what I can only describe as communication. Not quite whistles, not quite words, but definitely exchanges between at least 3 different sources. They seemed to be calling to each other from different positions around the house. The next few hours were the longest of my life. We sat in the living room, lights off, listening to movement outside. Sometimes it would be right up against the house, heavy breathing, scratching sounds on the walls. Other times they'd move further out, but we could still hear them breaking branches and making those weird calls. Around 3 a.m. the power suddenly came back on. The security lights flooded the yard, and everything went dead silent. When we finally worked up the courage to look outside again, they were gone. But they'd left evidence. Deep footprints in the soft ground near the porch, about 16 inches long, and several broken branches on trees at least 7 feet high. The cattle were still huddled together, trembling, on the far side of their pasture. The next day, Sarah's Uncle Tom came by to check on us. When he saw the footprints, he just nodded and said, "They usually don't come this close to houses." That's when he finally told us about the incidents they'd had over the years, similar encounters dating back to the 1980s. The floodlights he'd given us weren't for bears at all. They were because these things seemed to avoid bright lights. We installed more security lights after that, and motion sensors all around the property. The incidents became less frequent, but they didn't stop entirely. Sometimes we'd still hear those calls in the distance, or find strange prints in the mud after rain. The cattle never quite went back to normal. They'd still bunch up together sometimes, all facing the woods. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what we saw that night. I've looked up every large animal native to Oklahoma, studied local folklore, even contacted some researchers anonymously. But nothing quite matches what we experienced. The size, the movement, the intelligence they showed in their behavior, it all points to something that shouldn't exist, but clearly does. Sarah and I are still together, and we still live on that property. We've learned to coexist with whatever's out there. We don't go out at night anymore unless we absolutely have to, and we keep the floodlights well maintained. Sometimes, on quiet nights, we can hear them moving through the woods, and that musty, wild smell will drift across the property. We've come to accept that there are things in this world that defy explanation, and some of them live in the woods of eastern Oklahoma. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told me this before it happened, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But when you see something like that with your own eyes, when you hear those sounds and smell that distinctive odor, it changes you. There's no going back to thinking the world is exactly what we've been told it is. The most unnerving part? The locals, especially the older ones, they know. They won't talk about it openly, but they know. They've got their own stories, their own encounters. They've just learned to live with it, just like we have. Because what else can you do when something impossible becomes part of your reality? Story 8. This happened in late October 2020. Mark had been battling stage 4 lung cancer for about 8 months at that point, and the doctors had given him maybe 2 months left. We'd been friends since high school, and one thing we always loved doing together was going on camping and hiking trips. When he got his diagnosis, he made me promise we'd do one last expedition together, no matter how sick he got. By October, Mark was really weak, but he insisted on keeping his promise. We planned something simple, just a day trip through the woods near Broken Bow Lake, staying in the car mostly, stopping at some of our favorite old spots. Nothing too strenuous. The weather that day was unusually warm for October, probably around 65 degrees, overcast but not rainy. We left early, around 7 a.m., taking my Ford F-150. Everything was going fine until about 2 p.m. We were on this narrow dirt road about 12 miles northeast of Broken Bow, pretty deep in the forest. I remember checking my phone earlier and seeing no service, typical for that area. We'd been driving slowly, stopping occasionally so Mark could take photos of the fall colors. He was using this fancy new camera his wife had bought him. He wanted to leave some nice nature photos for his kids. That's when we came across this massive oak branch blocking the road. It wasn't there on our way in, so it must have fallen recently. I remember feeling annoyed because we'd have to clear it to get back. There wasn't enough space to turn around on that narrow road, and backing up for several miles wasn't an option. I pulled up about 20 feet from the branch and put the truck in park. "I'll take care of it," I told Mark, who was looking pretty tired. He just nodded, clutching his camera. The branch was big, maybe 8 feet long, and thick as my thigh. As I got out of the truck, the first thing that hit me was how quiet it was. You know that heavy silence that feels wrong? No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just dead silence. I walked up to the branch and grabbed one end, starting to drag it. That's when I heard it. A deep, rumbling sound from the woods to my right, maybe 50 yards in. It wasn't quite a growl, more like someone trying to imitate a big dog, but with this weird, almost human quality to it. I froze. Then, from the left side, maybe a bit further back, came an answering sound, similar but higher pitched. My blood ran cold. These weren't normal forest sounds. I've been hiking and camping in Oklahoma for 30 years, and I've never heard anything like it. The sounds had this intelligence to them, like they were communicating. Then I heard movement in the underbrush, heavy footsteps, breaking twigs, but from multiple directions. I started backing toward the truck, trying to move slowly, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. That's when I smelled it. This overwhelming stench, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. The sounds were getting closer, and now I could hear what seemed like 3 or 4 distinct voices, all making these weird call and response noises. Some were those deep rumbles, others were higher pitched, almost like whoops. They were coordinating, moving to surround us. I reached the truck and practically dove into the driver's seat. Mark was white as a sheet, his camera forgotten in his lap. "David," he whispered, "look at the trees." About 40 yards ahead, through the brush, I saw movement. Something massive and dark brown shifted between 2 trees. The shape was wrong. Too big to be a bear, walking on 2 legs. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. Then I saw another one, darker in color, moving parallel to the first, about 60 yards to our left. The communication between them continued, these horrible, almost human sounds getting more intense. I could see branches moving where they walked, these huge forms just barely visible through the trees. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. The whole truck stank of that awful smell now, even with the windows up. I threw it in reverse and started backing up as fast as I dared on that narrow road. Through the windshield, I saw a third figure step partially into view, closer than the others, maybe 30 yards away. The memory of it still haunts me. Massive shoulders, long arms, covered in dark reddish-brown hair. It turned its head toward us, and even through the brush, I could tell it was looking right at us. I've never reversed a vehicle so fast in my life. The truck bounced and scraped against branches, but I didn't care. We must have gone backward for at least half a mile before I found a spot wide enough to turn around. The whole time, those calls followed us, getting fainter, but never completely stopping. When we finally got back to the main road, Mark and I just sat there for a while, trying to process what happened. He was quiet for a long time before saying, "They were hunting us, weren't they? Working together to box us in." I couldn't disagree. We looked at the photos later. Mark had instinctively taken a few shots when everything started happening, but they just show blurry branches and dark shapes that could be anything. The really clear shots he took earlier that day, of the fall colors, somehow they were all corrupted on his camera, just static and weird artifacts. We never figured out why. Mark passed away 2 months later, almost exactly like the doctors predicted. On one of my last visits, he brought up that day again. He said he was glad it happened, in a weird way. Said it reminded him that there were still mysteries in the world, things we couldn't explain. I understood what he meant, but that day still terrifies me. I've heard other stories about Bigfoot encounters, but something about the ones near Broken Bow seems different, more organized, more aggressive. They knew exactly what they were doing that day, working as a group to trap us. I've never gone back to that road, and I never will. Sometimes I still wake up at night, hearing those awful, almost human calls in my dreams, smelling that horrific stench. I know how this story sounds. Before that day, I would have been the first person to laugh at Bigfoot stories. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. Those things were real, they were intelligent, and they were hunting us. Mark and I got lucky. I don't think everyone does. A few weeks after it happened, I tried reporting it to the local rangers, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. Can't blame them. I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't lived it. I've done some research since then, found other reports from that area describing similar experiences. Multiple creatures working together, that same terrible smell, the corrupted photos. But none of these reports ever make the news. It's like these things know how to stay just hidden enough to keep people doubting. I still go camping and hiking sometimes, but never alone and never near Broken Bow. And whenever I'm in the woods and everything goes quiet, that unnatural, heavy silence, I get back to my car as fast as I can, because now I know what that silence means. It means you're being hunted. Story 9. I'd been doing the same route for about 4 years at that point. It was a pretty isolated stretch. Lots of old farmland, abandoned cotton fields, and dense patches of forest between properties. Most of the mailboxes were spread out, sometimes half a mile or more apart. You get to know every inch of your route when you drive it 6 days a week, which is why I started noticing things were different. It was early October when I first spotted the tracks. The ground was soft from recent rain, and right next to the Hendersons' mailbox, about 12 miles into my route, there were these massive footprints. At first, I thought someone was playing a prank, making fake Bigfoot prints. But something about them seemed off. They were deep, really deep, like whatever made them had serious weight behind it. I'm talking about 16, 17 inches long, and the impression must have been at least 2 inches into the mud. I didn't think much of it that first day. Kids pull pranks, right? But then I started noticing more prints at different stops along my route. They were always near the mailboxes, as if whatever was making them was following my path. The prints would show up in places where no one could have snuck in to fake them without being seen by the homeowners. Some were in freshly gravelled driveways, others in wet grass where you could see the massive weight that had pressed down. The thing that really started getting to me was the pattern. These prints were getting progressively closer to where I usually parked to deliver mail. At the Wilkins place, they were about 30 feet from the mailbox. A few days later, at the old Johnson property, they were only 15 feet away. By the 3rd week, I was finding them right next to my tire tracks from the previous day. I started carrying a disposable camera in my truck. The Postal Service had these strict rules about personal items during delivery, but I didn't care anymore. I needed proof of what I was seeing. The photos came out, but they never really showed the scale right. They just looked like odd depressions in the ground. Then came October 23rd. I remember the date because it was my daughter's birthday, and I was planning to leave early that day to pick up her cake. It had been raining all morning, that heavy, sticky kind of southern rain that makes everything look grey and washed out. I was about halfway through my route, approaching one of the abandoned cotton fields that backed up to dense forest. The rain had let up a bit, but there was still this fine mist hanging in the air. I was reaching out my window to put mail in the Carmichael's box when I felt it, that weird sensation of being watched. You know that feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? It was like that, but 100 times worse. I slowly turned my head to the left, toward the cotton field, and that's when I saw it. Standing there maybe 50 yards away was this thing. It was massive, had to be at least 8, maybe 9 feet tall. The color was this dirty reddish brown like old rust. What really got me was how it was just standing there, not moving, not trying to hide, just watching me. It was holding something. I realized with horror it was a young deer, hanging limp from its hand like it was nothing more than a rag doll. The creature's shoulders must have been twice as wide as mine, and I'm not a small guy. Its arms were long, way too long, hanging down past its knees. The rain was still drizzling, and I could see water matting down its fur. That's how clear my view was. This wasn't some guy in a suit. This wasn't my mind playing tricks. This was real, and it was standing there looking right at me. I couldn't move. My hand was still halfway to the mailbox, frozen in place. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then I did something stupid. I started the truck. The engine noise seemed to break whatever spell we were both under. It didn't run away like you'd expect a wild animal to. It just turned and walked into the tree line. No rush, no panic. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. The way it moved was so fluid, so deliberate. Each step must have covered 3 or 4 feet, and it never looked back. I finished my route in record time that day. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely sort the mail. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see it following me. When I got back to the post office, I sat in my truck for a long time, trying to process what I'd seen. The next morning, I almost called in sick, but I had a job to do, and I told myself I was being ridiculous. It wasn't until I got to my truck that I noticed them, handprints on my windows. The rain had left this film of red clay dust on the glass, and there were these massive prints swept through it. They were huge. My entire hand spread out wide, barely covered half of one palm print. I took photos, but like the footprints, they just didn't capture it right. They looked like smudges in the dust. But I knew what I'd seen. My supervisor noticed how shaken up I was and asked what was wrong. I couldn't tell him the truth. Who would believe me? I just said I was having trouble with some aggressive dogs on my route. They ended up changing my route the following week, said they were optimizing delivery patterns. Maybe someone else had seen something too and reported it. Maybe they knew more than they let on. I don't know. I kept the photos for years but lost them when we moved in 2001. Sometimes I wish I still had them, but then I realized they wouldn't prove anything. They never did. The real proof was what I saw that rainy morning in that cotton field, and no photo could ever capture the sheer, terrifying reality of that moment. I still live in Alabama, but I moved closer to the city. I don't do rural routes anymore, switched to in-town delivery until I retired in 2015. Sometimes when it rains, especially in October, I think about that day. About those footprints getting closer and closer to my truck. About those handprints on my window. I've never seen anything like it since, and I hope I never do. But I know what I saw. That wasn't a man in a suit. It wasn't a bear. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist but does. And it was curious about me, just as I was terrified of it. The scariest part. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching other mail carriers on their routes, getting a little closer each day, leaving its prints in the mud beside rural mailboxes. And I wonder if anyone would believe them if they tried to tell their story, just like I'm telling mine now. Story 10. We'd moved to our cabin in Pine Grove in early 1988. My wife Sarah, our 2 kids, Tommy 12 and Lisa 9, and me. The property was everything we'd dreamed of, 15 acres of pristine woodland backing up against national forest, with our nearest neighbors about 2 miles down the old logging road. We had a small barn where we kept 2 horses, some chickens, and our German shepherd, Max. The isolation didn't bother us at first. We'd wanted to get away from Portland's growing crowds, and this seemed perfect. The trouble started in late September. At first, it was just our garbage cans getting knocked over at night. Living in rural Oregon, we were used to dealing with wildlife, bears, cougars, you name it. But this was different. The way the trash was scattered felt deliberate. Bears usually tear into bags looking for food, leaving everything shredded. This was more like someone methodically going through our garbage, item by item. I'd find things laid out almost in neat piles, food waste in one spot, papers in another. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but I tried to rationalize it. Then, one morning in early October, I found the footprints. I was doing my usual morning check of the property when I saw them in the soft soil near our compost pile. They were human-like, but massive, easily 18 inches long. The stride length between prints was over 5 feet. I'm no tracker, but I know enough to recognize that whatever made those prints was far bigger than any person I'd ever seen. The depth of the impressions suggested something incredibly heavy. That's when I decided to set up the security camera. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old VHS camera I'd borrowed from my brother-in-law, who ran a small security company. I mounted it under the eaves of our back porch, pointing toward the garbage area. Sarah thought I was being paranoid, but she hadn't seen those footprints like I had. The night of October 12th changed everything. It was a full moon, unusually bright for Oregon in autumn. I remember because Sarah had commented on how beautiful it looked through the kitchen window while we were cleaning up after dinner. Around 2 a.m., Max started going absolutely ballistic in the barn. This wasn't his usual barking at deer or raccoons. This was different. Pure terror. I'd never heard him make sounds like that before. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and headed to the back window. What I saw through the glass made my blood run cold. There, in the moonlight, was something going through our garbage cans. At first glance, you might have thought it was a bear standing up, but bears don't move like that. This thing was methodically picking through our trash with almost human-like movements. It must have been at least 8 feet tall, with massive shoulders and arms that hung down past its knees. The fur looked dark, almost black in the moonlight, but had a reddish tint where the light hit it directly. I stood there frozen, watching it through the window. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the flashlight. The creature suddenly stopped what it was doing and slowly turned its head toward the barn. Max's barking had turned to whimpers. The way it moved, it was so deliberate, so intelligent. That's when it hit me. This thing wasn't just some animal. There was purpose in its movements. Suddenly, it turned its head toward the house. I swear it looked right at me through the window. I've never felt smaller or more vulnerable in my life. Its eyes caught the moonlight and seemed to glow slightly. They weren't animal eyes. There was something eerily intelligent in that gaze. I didn't dare move or breathe. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then it did something I'll never forget. It slowly and deliberately placed the garbage can back upright, still maintaining eye contact with me. It wasn't the action of a wild animal. This thing wanted me to know it was conscious of what it was doing. Then it turned and walked into the forest on 2 legs, moving with a smooth gait that no bear could ever replicate. The next morning, I rushed to check the security camera. The footage was grainy, but it clearly showed everything I'd seen. I watched it dozens of times, trying to convince myself it was someone in a costume, but the fluid movements and the sheer size of the figure made that impossible. When I measured the garbage can against the creature's height in the video, I estimated it was close to 9 feet tall. Things escalated after that night. Our horses became increasingly agitated, especially after sunset. One morning, I found our mare, Belle, covered in sweat, with strange marks on her flanks that looked disturbingly like massive handprints. They were spread wider than any human hand could reach. After that, we started locking all the animals in the barn at night, reinforcing the doors with extra locks. The activity seemed to follow a pattern. It would always happen on clear nights, usually around the same time. We started finding strange structures in the woods around our property, branches twisted and woven together in ways that seemed impossible to occur naturally. The smell was another thing, a powerful, musky odor that would sometimes drift through the property, making our eyes water. It was unlike anything I'd ever encountered, not like a skunk or any other wildlife I knew. We weren't the only ones experiencing strange things. About 2 weeks after our encounter, I ran into Jim Parker, who owned the property about 3 miles down the road. He was visibly shaken as he told me about finding his cattle agitated and massive footprints in his fields. He'd also been hearing strange vocalizations at night, not quite human, not quite animal, that would echo through the valley. The final straw came in late October. I was in town getting supplies when Sarah called me in a panic. She'd been hanging laundry when she heard heavy breathing behind her. When she turned around, she saw it standing at the edge of the forest, partially hidden behind a large Douglas fir. She said it was just watching her, swaying slightly. She ran inside and locked all the doors. By the time I got home, it was gone. But we found fresh prints in the soft ground where she'd seen it. We seriously considered moving after that, but something kept us there. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was curiosity. The encounters gradually became less frequent as winter approached, though we'd still occasionally find prints or hear strange sounds in the night. By spring, the activity had almost completely stopped, though we never felt quite alone on the property again. I still have the VHS tape with the footage, though I haven't watched it in years. The camera quality was poor, and honestly, it doesn't do justice to what I saw with my own eyes that night. Sometimes I think about releasing it, but I know what happens to people who share things like this. I don't need the ridicule or attention. Looking back now, I realize how lucky we were. Whatever this creature was, it never showed any direct aggression toward us. It seemed more curious than threatening, though its size and strength were always implicitly menacing. We still own that property, though we moved closer to town years ago when the kids started high school. Our son Tommy manages it now, and sometimes he tells us about finding strange prints or hearing unusual sounds at night. He keeps a camera ready, just like I did, but so far he hasn't captured anything like what we saw that fall in 1988. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told me this before it happened, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw. That creature was real, and it was intelligent. It wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. It knew exactly what it was doing. And sometimes on clear nights when the moon is full, I still think about those eyes looking back at me through the window, and I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 11. Our team consisted of 4 people. Myself, Dave, our equipment specialist, and 2 junior surveyors, Mike and Sarah. We'd started the job on October 12th, and everything seemed normal for the first few days. The weather was typical for Tennessee that time of year, cool mornings giving way to mild afternoons, with a bit of fog lingering until mid-morning most days. The first strange thing we noticed was on day 4. We were working in a particularly dense section of forest when Sarah called me over to look at something. About 50 yards off our survey line, there was this structure. I hesitate to call it a shelter because of how massive it was, but that's clearly what it was intended to be. It was made of thick branches and small tree trunks, woven together in a way I'd never seen before. The thing that really got to me was the size. The ceiling had to be at least 9 or 10 feet high. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some local kids had built it? But the engineering involved was way too sophisticated, and some of the branches used were so heavy it would have taken significant strength to manipulate them. Dave took some measurements while I photographed it. I really wish I still had those photos, but I'll explain what happened to them later. The base was roughly circular, about 12 feet in diameter, with an entranceway you had to duck under despite its height. Inside, the ground was packed hard, like something heavy had been walking or sleeping there regularly. We found two more similar structures that same day, arranged in a rough triangle about 100 yards apart from each other. That's when we started noticing other things too. The trees around these structures had these deep gouges in them, but they weren't like any bear markings I'd ever seen in my 15 years of forestry work. They were too high up, some of them starting at around 8 feet off the ground and continuing up another 3-4 feet. The cuts were deep too, like they'd been made with incredible force. That evening at our base camp, we had a couple of trailers set up about a mile from our survey area. We discussed what we'd found. Mike suggested bears, but I'd worked in bear country before, and this wasn't bears. Sarah was quiet. She'd grown up in the area and mentioned that her grandfather used to tell stories about something living in these woods, but she wouldn't elaborate. The next morning was when things started getting truly unsettling. We arrived at our work site to find all of our surveying equipment, which we'd left secured under tarps, neatly stacked in a pile. Not thrown together, but deliberately stacked. Transit level on bottom, then stakes, then flags, all arranged by size. Nothing was damaged, just reorganized. We all looked at each other, but nobody said what we were thinking. Who would come out here in the middle of the night just to stack our equipment? The local wildlife seemed to know something wasn't right. Normally, these woods would be full of bird calls and small animal sounds, but as we worked, we started noticing periods of complete silence. It would happen suddenly. 1 minute, normal forest sounds, the next, dead quiet. During these silences, the air felt heavy, like right before a storm. More than once, I caught myself holding my breath, straining to hear something. That afternoon, we found the carcasses. In a small clearing near one of the structures, there were the remains of several deer and what looked like wild boars. They weren't scattered like you'd expect from normal predator kills. They were piled deliberately, with the larger bones sorted into separate piles. I'd never seen anything like it, and it made my skin crawl. The sounds started around 4 p.m. We were packing up for the day when we heard it. A long, low howl that didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard in these woods. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. It was deeper, more resonant, and it seemed to come from something much larger. Sarah dropped her equipment, and I saw real fear in her eyes. The howl was answered by another from a different direction, and that's when we decided to pack up early. That night, none of us slept well. The howls continued sporadically, sometimes seeming to come from right near our trailers. Around 2 a.m., something walked past my trailer. The footsteps were heavy enough to shake the whole vehicle slightly. I lay there, barely breathing, as whatever it was moved around outside. There was a smell, too, like wet dog mixed with something rotting, so strong it was seeping in through the sealed windows. The next morning, we found more than just stacked equipment. There were footprints all around our vehicles, massive prints, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. They were deeply pressed into the hard ground, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Dave, who'd always been the skeptic of the group, took one look at those prints and said he was done. I couldn't blame him, but what finally made us abandon the project happened later that morning. We were documenting the footprints, taking photos and measurements, when we heard movement in the dense undergrowth about 50 yards away. The forest had gone silent again, but this time we could hear heavy breathing, deep, rhythmic breaths that sounded almost human, but not quite. Through a gap in the leaves, I saw something that I've spent years trying to rationalize. It was tall, so tall that even partially crouched as it was, its head was well above the normal eye line. The fur was a deep, reddish-brown, matted in places, and its muscles were clearly visible even through the thick hair. But it was the eyes that got me. Very human-like, but wild, intelligent, and definitely aware of us. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then it moved, so fast for something so large, and the whole area erupted with crashing sounds and breaking branches. We all ran. Back to the trailers, grabbed our essential personal belongings, and got out of there. Left thousands of dollars of equipment behind. The photos from my camera were ruined. Every single one from the site was completely black, though photos from before and after were fine. Sarah quit the company the next day. Dave transferred to another state. Mike stuck around but refused to work anywhere near Carthage again. I filed a report with the company, but they made it clear that if I mentioned anything about giant footprints or unexplained structures, I'd be looking for a new job. The official report said we encountered aggressive bear activity and unsafe working conditions. Maybe that's better. Who'd believe the truth anyway? I drive through Carthage sometimes, and I always look toward those woods. Sometimes, especially in the fall when the leaves are turning the same color as that creature's fur, I think about going back, about trying to find those structures again. But then I remember those eyes, that intelligence behind them, and that deep feeling in my gut that we were the intruders there, not it. Some places, some things, maybe we're just not meant to understand. I still work in forestry, but I'm much more cautious now about remote locations. I pay attention to the sounds of the forest, especially when they stop. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can still hear those howls, calling to something out there in the darkness. The company eventually sent another survey crew out there about 6 months later. They reported no unusual findings, but they also didn't venture as deep into the woods as we had. The structures were gone. No trace of them was ever found. Sometimes I wonder if we imagined it all, but then I remember those footprints, those eyes, and I know what we saw was real. I just can't explain what it was. Story 12. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but what happened at my home in Clearwater, Idaho, back in 1995 still haunts me to this day. After 32 years of teaching 3rd grade at Clearwater Elementary, I'd settled into what I thought would be a quiet retirement, tending to my garden and enjoying life with my 3 dogs, Max, a German Shepherd, Lucy, a Border Collie, and Bear, a Black Lab mix. My little slice of heaven sat on 5 acres at the edge of the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, about 8 miles from town. I'd always loved the solitude, the way the pine trees swayed in the wind, and especially my vegetable garden, which I'd cultivated over the years into something I was truly proud of. The strange events started in early June. At first it was just little things, some of my ripest tomatoes missing, a few heads of lettuce harvested that I hadn't picked yet. I assumed it was deer. We'd always had problems with them in the area. What struck me as odd, though, was how selective the damage was. Usually deer would leave obvious signs, trampled plants, partially eaten vegetables, that sort of thing. But whatever was taking my produce was doing it with almost surgical precision. Only the perfectly ripe vegetables were being taken, and the plants themselves were completely undamaged. I called my neighbor Tom, who lived about a half-mile down the road, and he suggested installing an electric fence. It seemed like overkill for a vegetable garden, but I was getting frustrated with losing my best produce, so I went ahead and had one installed in mid-June. It was a serious setup, 6 feet high with 8 strands of wire. The fence company assured me it would keep out any deer or elk in the area. That's when things got weird. The very next morning after the fence installation, I went out to check my garden and found 3 perfectly ripe zucchinis missing. The fence was still hot, I checked, and there were no signs of anything digging under or jumping over. But somehow, something had gotten in and out without disturbing a single plant or leaving any obvious tracks in the soft soil I'd deliberately maintained around the garden's perimeter. What really started to unnerve me was my dog's behavior. Max, Lucy and Bear had always been excellent watchdogs. They'd bark at anything unusual, deer, elk, the occasional black bear. But around this time they started refusing to go outside at night. These were dogs that loved being outdoors, but suddenly, as soon as the sun started setting, they'd crowd into my bedroom and wouldn't leave until morning. Lucy especially would whine and pace if I tried to let them out for their usual evening bathroom break. I started staying up later, watching the garden from my kitchen window. The property was well lit with security lights, but I never saw anything. Yet every few days, more vegetables would disappear, always the ripest ones, always harvested with what seemed like careful precision. By early July, I was fed up. I'd mentioned the problem to my son during one of our weekly phone calls, and he insisted on buying me a trail camera with infrared capabilities. He had it shipped directly to my house, and I set it up facing the garden on July 15th. I remember the date clearly because it was my birthday, and I joked about getting myself an unusual present, proof of what was raiding my garden. The first few nights the camera caught nothing unusual, just normal wildlife. A few raccoons trying to figure out how to get past the fence, an owl swooping down to catch a mouse. But on the night of July 19th, everything changed. I still have trouble describing what I saw in those photos. The first image was time-stamped 2:47 a.m. Something massive was standing in my garden, way too big to be a bear or any animal I'd ever seen in Idaho. The infrared made everything look ghostly, but I could clearly make out a figure that had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was covered in what appeared to be thick hair or fur, but what struck me most was how it was standing, completely upright, like a person. The sequence of photos showed this creature methodically moving through my garden. It would carefully step over rows of plants, reach down with surprisingly dexterous hands, and examine vegetables before selecting ones to pick. In one crystal-clear frame, I could see it holding a tomato up close to what I assumed was its face, almost like it was checking for ripeness. The proportions were all wrong for a person in a suit. The arms were too long, the shoulders too wide, and the head seemed to sit directly on the shoulders with barely any neck visible. But what truly chilled me to the bone was the intelligence evident in its movements. This wasn't an animal randomly foraging. The creature was selecting specific vegetables, taking only what was ripe, and somehow managing to move through the garden without damaging a single plant. In one photo, you can see it carefully stepping over my pepper plants, its foot raised high to avoid crushing them. I didn't sleep at all that night after reviewing the photos. My dogs were huddled in my room as usual, and now their behavior made perfect sense. They'd known something was out there, something that wasn't natural to our woods. The next day, I called the local sheriff's office. Deputy Wilson came out, and I showed him the photos. I expected him to laugh or tell me it was just someone in a costume, but he was surprisingly serious. He examined my garden, noting how the electric fence showed no signs of tampering. He asked if he could take copies of the photos and mentioned that there had been other strange reports from the area over the years, though nothing with this kind of evidence. What happened next still gives me goosebumps. That night, I set up 2 more cameras and stayed up watching from my bedroom window, which had the best view of the garden. Around 2:30 a.m., the security lights suddenly went dark. At first, I thought it was a power outage, but the lamp in my room was still on. Then I heard it, a deep, rumbling sound, almost below the threshold of hearing, but I could feel it in my chest. My dogs, who were pressed against me, started trembling. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could hear movement in the garden, careful, deliberate movements. The sound of vegetables being picked, of something large moving with surprising grace between the plants. I was frozen in place, torn between fear and fascination. This continued for maybe 15 minutes, and then the security lights suddenly came back on. The garden was empty, but several ripe vegetables were missing. tomatoes, cucumbers, and some bell peppers. When I checked the cameras the next morning, all 3 had been turned to face the ground somehow, without being damaged. That was the last night it came to my garden. The rest of the summer passed without incident, though my dogs continued to be reluctant to go out at night. I never reported what happened beyond that initial police report. Who would believe me? The photos I had showed something strange, yes, but they weren't clear enough to be conclusive proof of anything. I still live in the same house, still maintain my garden, though I've since moved it closer to the house. I've never caught another glimpse of whatever visited that summer, but sometimes, on very quiet nights, I can feel that deep, subsonic rumble, and my dogs, different ones now, but they act the same, refuse to leave the house. The original photos were damaged in a basement flood a few years later. At least, that's what I tell people. The truth is, I still have them, locked away in a safety deposit box at the bank. I've never shown them to anyone else. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and some mysteries might be better left unexplained. But I will say this, whatever was visiting my garden wasn't malicious. It was intelligent, careful, and showed a respect for my garden that still amazes me. It only took what it needed, only took what was ripe, and never damaged a single plant. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there in the forests of Idaho, perhaps visiting other gardens, carefully harvesting what it needs while the owners sleep unaware. One thing's for certain. I've never looked at my garden the same way since that summer, and every time I harvest vegetables, I can't help but remember those careful, deliberate hands selecting produce in the infrared glow of my trail camera. Story 13. I need to get this off my chest after keeping it buried for over 40 years. I was a night shift foreman at the Blackville No. 2 mine back in '79, and what I experienced there still haunts me to this day. I'm not looking for anyone to believe me. Hell, I can barely believe it myself sometimes. But I need to share what happened during those terrifying weeks in the fall of 1979. I'd been working the mines for nearly 15 years at that point, and the night shift never bothered me. The darkness, the isolation, it was just part of the job. But everything changed that September. It started with little things at first, things you could easily write off if you weren't paying attention. The first odd occurrence was on September 12th. I remember the date clearly because it was my daughter's birthday, and I'd promised to take her shopping that weekend to make up for missing her special day due to work. It was around 3:15 a.m., and I was doing my regular rounds, checking on the crews. The temperature had dropped to about 45 degrees that night, and there was no moon, just that pitch-black West Virginia darkness that seems to swallow everything. I was walking near the mine entrance when I first noticed something was off. You know how sometimes you can just feel when something isn't right? The usual night sounds, crickets, occasional owl calls, the distant whir of equipment, they all just stopped. At first, I thought maybe it was just the wind changing direction, but there was no wind, just this heavy, oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That's when I caught that smell. Anyone who's worked in the mines knows all the usual smells, coal dust, machinery, that musty underground scent. But this was different. It was this overwhelming, putrid odor, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog, but somehow worse. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I shined my flashlight toward the tree line, about 50 yards from the mine entrance. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on my eyes, but then it moved. Standing between two large oak trees was this figure. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. The beam of my flashlight caught its eyes for just a second. They reflected back this dull, reddish-orange color, like dying embers. My whole body went cold. I've been face to face with cave-ins, gas leaks, and all sorts of mining accidents, but nothing had ever made me freeze up like this. The thing was massive. Its shoulders must have been twice as wide as a normal man's. The hair covering its body looked matted and dark, and even from that distance I could see its chest heaving as it breathed. For what felt like forever, we just stood there, staring at each other. Then one of the conveyor belts back in the mine made a loud grinding noise, and the creature, it turned its head toward the sound so fast it was almost unnatural. That's when I saw its full face. The features were almost human-like, but wrong somehow. The brow was too pronounced, the jaw too heavy. I'd love to say I did something brave or heroic, but the truth is, I backed away slowly until I reached the mine entrance, then turned and walked as fast as I could, back to where the rest of the crew was working. I didn't run. Something in my gut told me running would be the worst thing I could do. The next few nights were quiet, but that silence was worse than any noise. Everyone on the crew could feel something was wrong. The normal joking and banter during breaks stopped. People started working closer together, and no one wanted to go near the entrance alone. Then, about a week later, on September 19th, things escalated. I was with Mike Peterson, one of our most experienced miners, checking some support beams near the entrance when we heard it, this deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It started low, almost like a growl, then built into something that sounded almost like words, but not quite. Mike dropped his wrench, and the clang echoed through the tunnel. That's when we heard the response. Another call, but this one came from further up in the hills, maybe near those old caverns everyone knew about but nobody ever explored. The next morning, I decided to check around the entrance before heading home. That's when I found the tracks. They were massive, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. The stride length between them was incredible, at least 6 feet apart. But what really got me was the depth of the impressions. Whatever made these tracks had to weigh at least 500 pounds, probably more. I took some measurements and photos with my Polaroid, but they didn't come out very clear in the early morning light. Things got worse over the next few weeks. More crew members started reporting sightings. Jim Conley swore he saw it standing on a ridge above the mine, silhouetted against the sky. Sarah Martinez, our equipment operator, said she heard something massive moving through the trees while she was on her smoke break, snapping branches that would have taken 2 men to break. The breaking point came on October 3rd. We were working with a smaller crew that night. Flu season had hit hard, and we were down to about 60% staffing. Around 3 a.m., right on schedule, the power went out. This wasn't totally unusual. We had backup generators for exactly this reason. But when Frank Wesley went to check the breaker box near the entrance, he came running back white as a sheet. He said he'd seen it up close, real close. Said it was standing right by the breaker box, like it was studying it. Frank described these huge hands, with fingers nearly twice as long as a human's, and said when the creature turned to look at him, its eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. He said it didn't move aggressively, just stood there, watching him. But when Frank took a step backward, it made this sound, like a mix between a whale song and thunder, if that makes any sense. And Frank just ran. The company tried to keep things quiet at first. They hired armed security to patrol the perimeter, installed more lights around the entrance, but it didn't help. The sightings continued, always around the same time, always on the darkest nights. We found more tracks leading to and from those caverns up in the hills. Sometimes we'd find these strange structures in the woods, branches woven together in ways that seemed deliberate, but didn't match any kind of human construction I'd ever seen. What really gets me, even now, is how it seemed to be studying us. It wasn't just random appearances. It was learning our patterns, our weaknesses. It knew when our shifts changed, when we were most vulnerable. Several times we found the electrical boxes had been tampered with, but not destroyed. like something was trying to understand how they worked. By late October, we'd lost almost half our night shift workers. People either quit outright or suddenly developed health problems that kept them on day shift only. The company finally had to reduce night operations to a skeleton crew with double the security presence. The last time I saw it was October 31st. Yeah, Halloween night, though that detail almost seems too perfect. I was doing a final check before we closed up for the night. By this point, we'd changed our hours to shut down between 2:30 and 4:30 a.m. The security guards were positioned around the perimeter, and we had those big industrial floodlights running. I was noting some maintenance issues in my log when I heard one of the guards yell. By the time I got to the entrance, 2 of them were pointing their lights into the trees, but they were shaking so bad they could barely hold them steady. The smell was back, stronger than ever, and through the trees I could see movement, something massive shifting in the darkness between the floodlight beams. Then it stepped into one of the light beams, just for a moment. In that brief instant, I saw it clearly, at least 9 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. Its face, God, its face. It was too human. Not like a mask or a costume, but like something that was almost human, but took a different evolutionary path. It looked right at me, and in that moment, I swear I saw intelligence in those eyes. Not animal intelligence, but something different. Then the floodlights went out, all of them at the same time. The backup generators kicked in about 30 seconds later, but by then it was gone. We found the electrical panels had been opened, not damaged, just opened, like it wanted us to know it could have broken them, but chose not to. That was the last time anyone saw it at our mine. The company brought in some experts, game wardens, even some government types in suits who asked a lot of questions, but didn't say much. They searched those caverns, but never found anything conclusive. By December, things had pretty much gone back to normal, though we kept the extra security and lights. I stayed on at the mine until I retired in '95, but I never worked another night shift. None of us who were there during those weeks in '79 ever did. The company eventually sealed off those caverns, claiming safety concerns about instability. Maybe that was true, or maybe they knew something they weren't telling us. I've spent decades trying to make sense of what happened during those weeks. Was it some kind of territorial dispute? Were we getting too close to something in those caverns? Was it trying to communicate something? I don't know. But I do know what I saw, what we all saw. And sometimes on dark nights when the wind is still and the crickets go quiet, I still find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those eyes watching me from the darkness. Story 14. I'd heard about a nesting pair of bald eagles in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, about 15 miles east of Maple Falls. It was the perfect time of year to catch them hunting salmon. I packed my usual gear, my Canon EOS with multiple lenses, a decent tent, enough food for 5 days, and my trusty weather-sealed bags. Nothing unusual about the setup. I'd done this hundreds of times before. The first day was completely normal. I found a great spot about 200 yards from where I'd spotted the eagle's nest, set up camp near a small clearing that gave me decent sight lines to the nest, while keeping me partially concealed in the tree line. The weather was typical for October in Washington, overcast, cool, with occasional light drizzle. I remember checking my phone's weather app before losing signal. It was showing temperatures would drop to around 45 degrees at night. Everything changed on the morning of day 2. I woke up around 5:30 a.m., planning to catch the eagles in the early morning light. The moment I unzipped my tent, something felt off. You know that feeling when someone's been in your house while you were sleeping? That's what it felt like. The air seemed different somehow. Then I saw it. All my gear, every single item I'd left under my rainfly outside the tent, was stacked in a neat pile about 50 meters away, Not thrown around like a bear would do, not scattered like it would be if raccoons had gotten into it. Stacked, methodically. My cooler was at the bottom, then my camera bags, thankfully still sealed, cooking equipment, everything perfectly balanced on top of each other like some weird camping supply store display. My hands were shaking as I walked over to check the pile. Nothing was damaged or even wet, despite the overnight drizzle. That's when I noticed the ground around the pile. The soil there was mostly rocky, but in a few softer patches, I could see what looked like partial footprints. Not bear tracks. I know what those look like. These were huge, probably 16-17 inches long from what I could make out, but the rocky ground only showed pieces of each print. I spent the whole day feeling watched. Wildlife photographers develop a sixth sense about animal presence. You have to when you're tracking skittish creatures. But this was different. The forest felt wrong. The usual bird calls were muted, and I didn't see a single eagle that day despite perfect hunting conditions at the river. That night, it started. I was lying in my tent, clutching my flashlight, when I heard something large moving around the perimeter of my camp. The footsteps were heavy but deliberate, like whatever it was didn't want to make noise but couldn't help it due to its size. I estimated it was circling about 30-40 yards out, just at the edge of where my hearing could pick up movement. I didn't sleep at all that night. The circling continued for hours, occasionally punctuated by the sound of branches snapping, not like when you step on dead wood, but like when something very strong deliberately breaks a thick branch. The third night was the worst. The activity started earlier, right at dusk. The circling was closer now, maybe 20 yards out. That's when I heard the sounds. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to recognize most animal calls, but this was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It started as a low, rumbling growl, but then it changed. The only way I can describe it is that it sounded like language, but not any language I'd ever heard. The sounds had distinct patterns, almost like phrases, with different tones and lengths. It wasn't random animal noise. It felt structured, intentional. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely hold my camera, but I managed to set up my flash and took several photos in the direction of the sounds. Most shots showed nothing but darkness, but two of them. I still get chills looking at them. About 9 feet up in the air, there were two eyes reflecting the flash. Not like a deer or bear's eyes. These were different, more forward-facing, more intelligent-looking. The space between them suggested something with a massive head. Around 3 a.m., everything suddenly went silent. The forest felt different again, like a pressure had lifted. I stayed awake until sunrise, packed up my camp in record time, and got out of there. I never did get those eagle photos. I've been back to other spots in the area since then, but never to that specific location. I still do wildlife photography, but something changed in me after those nights. The woods feel different now, like I know there's something out there that shouldn't exist, something that walks the line between animal and something else. I've analyzed those photos countless times. I've shown them to a few trusted friends, including a wildlife biologist. No one can explain what kind of animal would have eyes at that height, with that spacing, with that particular reflective pattern. The footprints, the organized pile of gear, the language-like sounds. It all points to something with intelligence, something that was studying me as much as I study the animals I photograph. Sometimes I wake up at night, remembering the sound of those heavy footsteps circling my tent, and that deep, rumbling, not quite language. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just sharing what happened to me out there. There are things in our forests that we don't understand, things that maybe we're not supposed to understand. All I know is that whatever was watching me those nights, it wasn't just some undiscovered animal. It was something more. The strange thing is, when I got home and checked my equipment, nothing was missing or damaged. Even my food was untouched. It's like whatever it was wasn't interested in my supplies. It was interested in me. That's what haunts me the most. It wasn't just a random encounter with a curious animal. It felt deliberate, calculated, like I was being observed and tested. For what purpose, I still don't know. I still have those photos somewhere, stored on an old hard drive, but I've never shared them publicly. Not because I'm worried about ridicule. I've had a successful enough career that I can handle skepticism. It's more that those photos feel private somehow, like evidence of something I wasn't meant to see. Maybe someday I'll feel ready to share them, but for now, they remain like the experience itself, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy our comfortable explanations. Story 15. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but after what happened at our home in Copper Harbor during the winter of 2015, I feel like I need to get this off my chest. My wife Martha and I, both in our early 70s then, had lived in our house for over 40 years. It's pretty isolated, about 3 miles outside of town, surrounded by dense forest, with our nearest neighbor being almost a mile away. We loved the solitude and had our own little paradise with a beautiful garden and orchard we'd cultivated over the decades. The first strange thing started happening in late August. I've been tending to our fruit trees for decades. We have about 15 apple trees and 8 pear trees that we planted ourselves when we first moved here. I know exactly how much fruit each tree produces and when they ripen. I'd been checking them daily, waiting for the perfect time to harvest. But one morning, I noticed something odd about our oldest Honeycrisp apple tree. The previous evening, it had been loaded with nearly ripe apples. The next morning, every single apple above about 12 feet was gone. Not fallen on the ground, just gone. Clean breaks on the stems, like they'd been picked. Now, I'm no stranger to dealing with wildlife. We get deer, bears, and all sorts of critters out here. But this was different. Bears leave damage, broken branches, claw marks. This was clean, deliberate harvesting, going systematically from top to bottom. At first, I thought maybe some teenagers had come with ladders in the night for a prank, though that seemed unlikely given how far we are from town. But then it kept happening, night after night, moving from tree to tree. The weird thing was, some of these apples were being picked from heights of 20-25 feet. You'd need professional picking equipment or a cherry picker to reach them. We didn't hear any vehicles or machinery at night, and there were never any tire tracks or equipment marks. Martha suggested setting up some trail cameras, so we mounted 4 of them around the orchard. The first few nights, nothing showed up on the footage. Then the batteries started dying unusually quickly, and when we'd check the footage, we'd just find gaps in the recording or completely black frames. This wasn't normal. We'd used these same cameras to watch wildlife in our yard for years without issues. The real shock came in early October after our first light snow. I went out to check on the remaining pear trees one morning, and there they were, footprints. Not animal tracks, not human boots. Actual bare footprints. Each one easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. They were deep too, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. They went right up to our tallest pear tree, where again all the fruit above 12 feet had been picked clean. I'm not some gullible old man. I worked as a forest ranger for 35 years before retiring. I know tracks, and I know the wildlife in these parts. These weren't bear tracks, weren't moose tracks, weren't anything I'd ever seen in all my years in the woods. I took photos and measurements, made plaster casts, but the next snow covered everything up. The activity seemed to die down as winter set in and the fruit season ended. But then something even more disturbing started happening. We began finding gifts. That's the only way I can describe them. Every few mornings we'd find small animals, rabbits, squirrels, the occasional fox, arranged in neat piles on our front porch. They weren't mangled or eaten, just killed cleanly and stacked with almost ritual-like precision. Sometimes there would be branches of winter berries or pine boughs arranged around them. The first time it happened, Martha called the police. They came out, took some photos, and suggested it might be coyotes or wolves leaving their kills. But we've seen plenty of predator kills. These were different. The animals were arranged deliberately, positioned with care. And there were always those massive footprints in the snow around our porch, though they seemed to vanish into the tree line without any clear trail. The smell started in December. On certain nights, usually when we'd find a gift the next morning, there would be this overwhelming musky odor around the house. It was like wet dog mixed with something rotting, but more wild. It was strong enough to wake us up sometimes, seeping through the closed windows. Our dog, an old German shepherd named Max, would go absolutely crazy on these nights, whining, pacing, refusing to go outside even to relieve himself. One night in January, around 2 a.m., we heard what sounded like wood knocking coming from the forest, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree. Knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct hits, then silence for a few minutes, then another 3. This went on for about an hour. We'd heard stories about wood knocking in the forests around here, but had always dismissed them as tall tales. The scariest night was in late February. The temperature had dropped to about 15 degrees, and we were huddled in the living room by the fireplace. Around dusk, Max started acting strange again, growling at the windows, hackles raised. Then we heard it, this deep, rumbling sound, almost like a groan but not quite human. It seemed to be coming from all around the house. I got up to check the windows, and that's when I saw it. Standing between our apple trees, partially hidden by the falling snow, was something massive. In the dim light I could make out a shape that had to be at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, shaggy fur. It was just standing there, swaying slightly. I could see steam rising from its body in the cold air. I reached for my phone to try to take a picture, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't unlock it. When I looked back up, the figure was gone, but the groaning continued for another hour, moving around the house. We sat there in terrified silence, Max pressed against our legs, trembling. The next morning, we found more footprints in the fresh snow, dozens of them, circling our entire house. And on the porch was the largest gift yet, 3 white-tailed deer, carefully arranged in a triangle, with pine branches and winter berries placed around them like some sort of decoration. This pattern continued through the rest of winter, the gifts, the sounds, the footprints. We considered selling the house, but this was our home, where we'd spent our entire married life. Plus, whatever it was, had never actually tried to harm us. If anything, it seemed to be trying to provide for us. The gifts were always fresh, clean kills, almost like offerings. As spring approached, the activity gradually decreased. The last gift we found was in early April, a single rabbit with the first spring wildflowers arranged around it. After that, nothing. No more footprints, no more sounds, no more gifts. It was like whatever had been visiting us just moved on. We still live in the same house, and our fruit trees still produce plenty of apples and pears. Sometimes in late summer, we'll find the upper branches picked clean overnight, but we've learned to leave them be. We don't set up cameras anymore, and we make sure to leave some fruit unharvested on the highest branches. I've never told this story publicly before. Our children think we're just spinning tales in our old age, and I understand their skepticism. But Martha and I know what we experienced that winter. Something intelligent was out there, something that understood the concept of giving, of trade perhaps. It took our fruit and left us game in return. The locals have their theories about what lurks in the forests around Copper Harbor. The Ojibwe people have ancient stories about a tall creature they called the Misabe, Others talk about Bigfoot sightings dating back generations. I don't know what visited us that winter, and I don't need to put a name to it. But I do know that our understanding of what lives in these woods is far from complete. Sometimes on cold winter nights, when the wind dies down, we still hear those wood knocks in the distance. We don't investigate anymore. We just stoke the fire, keep Max close, and remember to be grateful that whatever it is chose to show us kindness rather than hostility. And every fall, we make sure to leave plenty of fruit on those highest branches, a small price to pay for peaceful coexistence with whatever shares these woods with us. Story 16. I've been a park ranger at Lost Creek State Park in Montana for over 15 years now, but what I experienced in the summer of 1997 still keeps me up at night sometimes. I've never shared this publicly before, but I feel like I need to get this off my chest. I'm not looking for explanations or trying to convince anyone. I just need to document what happened. It started during my regular patrols in early June. I was checking the more remote areas of the park, particularly along Lost Creek itself, when I first noticed something odd. About 3 miles from the nearest hiking trail, I found what looked like a young aspen tree, maybe 15 feet tall, completely uprooted and wedged between 2 larger trees. At first, I assumed it was storm damage, even though we hadn't had any severe weather recently. But something felt off about it. The root system was intact, like it had been pulled straight out of the ground, and the way it was positioned seemed almost deliberate. I took some photos and GPS coordinates, planning to file it in my weekly report. But what I found the next week during my patrol made me forget all about that single tree. About half a mile upstream from the first location, I discovered what I can only describe as a structure. 5 or 6 young trees, all uprooted completely, had been woven together into something that looked like a massive teepee. Each tree was at least 12-15 feet tall, and the roots were all intact, still with clumps of dirt clinging to them. The trees weren't broken or snapped. They had been pulled out of the ground with what must have been incredible force. The weaving pattern wasn't random either. The trees were interlaced in a complex way that I couldn't fully understand, even after 15 years of forestry experience. Some of the smaller branches were twisted and knotted together in patterns that seemed impossible to achieve without tools. But there were no cut marks, no rope, nothing artificial at all. Just trees woven together like they were blades of grass. That's when I started setting up trail cameras. I placed 3 high-quality motion-activated cameras around the structure, making sure they had fresh batteries and empty memory cards. I remember feeling stupid about it, like I was overreacting to what was probably just some elaborate prank by local kids. But deep down, I knew better. No group of people could have pulled those trees up like that, and certainly not without leaving any traces of tools or equipment. A week later, I found another structure about 1/4 mile further upstream. This one was even larger, maybe 20 feet tall, made from 8 or 9 trees. The pattern was becoming clear. Whatever was building these things was following the creek deeper into the wilderness. But what absolutely chilled me to the bone was checking the trail cameras. All 3 cameras had malfunctioned in exactly the same way. The daytime footage was fine, showing deer, elk, and other normal wildlife. But every night, at exactly 2:17 a.m., the footage would dissolve into static and interference. This would last for exactly 43 minutes before clearing up again. Every single night. Same time, same duration. I'm not talking about normal nighttime camera issues. This was different. The static had patterns in it, almost like shadows moving behind thick fog. The smell was the next thing I noticed. Around the newer structures, there was this overwhelming odor that I can only describe as a mix between wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something metallic, like blood, but different. It was strongest in the early mornings and seemed to fade by afternoon. None of the local wildlife would come near the structures either. In 15 years of working these woods, I'd never seen the animals avoid any area like this. I started hearing things too. At first, it was just the absence of normal forest sounds. You know how the woods get quiet when there's a predator around? It was like that, but more complete, more oppressive. Then came the wood knocks, not like woodpeckers. These were deep, resonant thuds that you could feel in your chest. They always came in sets of 3, spaced exactly 10 seconds apart. I timed it once. They would echo through the valley, but you could never quite tell which direction they came from. By late June, there were 7 structures along a 2-mile stretch of the creek. Each one was more elaborate than the last, and they seemed to be getting bigger. The latest one used trees that must have been at least 25 feet tall. The force required to pull something like that out of the ground, it's just not possible. Not for a human, not for any animal I know of. I started staying late, setting up observation posts. I'd sit in my truck, or sometimes in a portable blind, watching the structures through night vision binoculars. The wildlife activity around these areas had completely ceased. No deer, no elk, not even insects. The only movement would be the occasional shadow that seemed to dart between trees, always just at the edge of my vision. Then came the night of July 3rd. I'll never forget it. I was in my blind about 100 yards from the newest structure, which had appeared just 2 days before. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped suddenly. I could see my breath in the July air. The static on my radio started going crazy, and my flashlight began flickering even though I'd just put in fresh batteries. That's when I heard it. A deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was almost like someone trying to talk underwater, but at a frequency that made my bones vibrate. The sound lasted for maybe 30 seconds, and in that time, I swear I could feel something watching me. Not just watching, studying me. Through my night vision binoculars, I saw movement near the structure. Something massive moved between the trees with an impossible grace for its size. I couldn't make out details. It was like my eyes refused to focus on it directly. But I caught glimpses. Massive shoulders, long arms that seemed to reach almost to the ground, and what looked like a head that sat directly on those shoulders, no neck visible. I sat there, completely frozen, as this thing moved around the structure. It reached up, way up, and began manipulating the woven trees with those long arms. The movements were deliberate, almost delicate. That's when my camera battery died, my radio exploded in static, and my flashlight went out completely. I'd like to say I was brave enough to stay and watch, but I wasn't. I got out of there as fast as I could, leaving most of my gear behind. When I returned the next morning with 2 other rangers, the structure had changed. The weaving was tighter, more complex, and there were fresh trees added to it. My gear was placed neatly at the base of the structure, undamaged, but with all batteries completely drained. The structures stopped appearing after that night. Over the next few months they began to deteriorate naturally, and by the following spring they were gone completely. I've never found anything like them since, though sometimes I still hear those wood knocks in the distance, always in sets of 3. I filed all the official reports, documented everything with photos, though most of them came out strangely blurred or overexposed, and even had wildlife biologists come out to examine the sites. They found nothing conclusive, no hair, no prints, nothing that could explain what had happened. The soil analysis around the uprooted trees showed they had been pulled up with a force exceeding several tons, but there were no signs of machinery or tools being used. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or what built those structures. I've heard all the theories, everything from elaborate pranks to secret military experiments. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know what I felt. Something intelligent was building those structures, something that could manipulate trees like they were twigs, something that didn't want to be seen but didn't mind letting me know it was there. I still work at Lost Creek, still patrol those same areas. The wildlife has returned, and everything seems normal now. But sometimes, when I'm out on late patrols, I'll catch that distinctive smell on the wind, or see shadows moving in ways they shouldn't, or hear those 3 wood knocks echoing through the valley. And I know whatever it was, it's still out there, watching, waiting, building its mysterious structures for reasons I'll never understand. Story 17. It started in early April. The weather was unusually warm for that time of year, and the mountains still had that stark, leafless look before the spring growth really kicks in. I remember doing my morning count of the flock. Something felt off right away. 2 ewes were missing from the east pasture. At first, I figured they might have pushed through a weak spot in the fence, but when I checked, the fencing was completely intact. What really got me was the fence height, a solid 6.5 feet tall. I'd installed it myself just the previous year to keep out jumpers. The weird thing was the complete lack of evidence. No blood, no wool tufts, no signs of struggle, just gone. My border collies, Mac and Jessie, who usually go crazy at any sign of predators, were acting strange too. Mac, especially. He's usually my best guard dog, but that morning he just sat there, whining and refusing to help me search the perimeter like he usually would. I called the local sheriff's office, but they just logged it as routine livestock theft. I knew better. I've had sheep stolen before. Thieves leave tire tracks, cut fences, leave gates open. This was different. After losing 2 more sheep the following week, I invested in some trail cameras. Nothing fancy, just your basic Moultrie game cams with night vision. I set them up around the perimeter of the east pasture, figuring whatever was taking my sheep would eventually show up again. For about a week, nothing happened. Then came the night of April 23rd. I remember the date clearly because it was my daughter's birthday, and we'd had a small family celebration earlier. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to Mac and Jessie raising absolute hell on the back porch, but this wasn't their usual barking at deer or coyotes. This was different, more panicked, with these weird pauses where they'd just whimper. I grabbed my shotgun and flashlight, threw on my boots, and headed out. The minute I stepped onto the porch, I was hit by this smell, like wet dog mixed with rotting meat, but worse, much worse. It was so strong it made my eyes water. The dogs wouldn't leave the porch, which was absolutely not like them. Mac was practically plastered against the door, all his usual bravery gone. The night was clear, with a nearly full moon, but there was this weird mist hanging low over the pasture. As I swept my flashlight across the field, I noticed the sheep were all clustered in one corner, dead silent. That's when I heard it. This deep, low whoosh of air, like something huge breathing, coming from near the tree line. I swung my light in that direction, and for a split second I caught movement. Something massive stepped behind a large oak tree. And when I say massive, I mean it had to duck under branches that were at least 8 feet high. The tree trunk was about 3 feet wide, and whatever this thing was, it was wide enough that its shoulders extended past both sides of it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the flashlight steady. That's when I heard the wood crack. This thing was pulling at branches, actually breaking them off the tree like they were twigs. The sound was like gunshots in the quiet night air. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I backed up onto my porch. All my years of hunting and dealing with wild animals went right out the window. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get inside. But I needed evidence. I'd already lost 6 sheep at this point, and insurance was giving me hell about the claims. I remembered the trail cameras and figured at least one of them must have caught something. That's when I heard the fence rattle. Not shake like something hitting it, rattle like something was climbing it. I raised my flashlight just in time to see a shape clearing the top of my 6.5-foot fence, like it was stepping over a garden hedge. It had one of my sheep tucked under its arm like a football, The sight hit me with this weird mix of terror and anger. That was an expensive breeding ewe it was carrying. Without thinking, I fired a warning shot into the air. Biggest mistake of my life. This thing, it turned toward me. I still have nightmares about those eyes catching the flashlight beam. They reflected red, like a coyote's but bigger, and much higher off the ground. Then it made this sound, not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but this awful combination of both that made my whole body go cold. The sheep under its arm was just limp, either dead or paralyzed with fear. I fired another shot, this time in its direction, but not really aiming to hit it, more out of panic than anything else. The creature dropped the sheep, which immediately bolted, and took off toward the woods with this weird, loping stride. It was easily covering 15-20 feet with each step. The way it moved, it was just wrong. Too fluid for something that size, too fast. The next morning I checked the cameras with shaking hands. Most of them showed nothing, just normal nighttime footage of the pasture. But one, the one nearest to where I saw it climb the fence, had captured something. The footage was grainy, typical night vision quality, but you can clearly see this huge, dark figure move into frame. It's massive. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall, but built thick. The recording shows it walking up to the fence, and here's the part that still makes my skin crawl. It studies the fence for a moment, then methodically climbs it, using the posts as handholds. This wasn't some animal acting on instinct. This thing was thinking, planning. The sheriff's deputy who came out the next day clearly thought I was nuts, even with the footage. He suggested it might be someone in a costume, but I know better. No human could move like that, could be that big. The way it climbed that fence, it had strength beyond anything I've ever seen. I spent the next week reinforcing fences, installing more lights, and moving the sheep closer to the house at night. I even hired a night watchman, but he quit after 2 shifts, saying he kept hearing something massive moving just beyond the tree line, but every time he'd go to investigate, it would go quiet. The attacks stopped as suddenly as they began. By early May, whatever it was had moved on. In total, I lost 9 sheep over those few weeks. The insurance company eventually paid out, listing the cause as unknown predator activity. I've still got the camera footage saved on an old hard drive, but I rarely look at it. Some things you're better off not thinking about too much. I still run my farm, but things are different now. I don't go out at night without a powerful light and my rifle. The dogs still get nervous around the east pasture, especially on quiet nights. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I catch that same awful smell drifting up from the woods. And every now and then, usually in the early hours of the morning, I'll hear that breathing sound again, that deep, rhythmic whoosh that's too big to be anything natural. I know how this all sounds. If someone had told me this story 12 years ago, I'd have thought they were crazy or lying, but I know what I saw. There's something out there in those mountains that shouldn't exist, something that walks like a man but isn't one. And the scariest part? Sometimes on really quiet nights, I swear I can feel it watching the farm from those woods, like it's just waiting for the right moment to come back. The local papers ran a small story about missing livestock in the area that spring, but it was blamed on coyotes. A few other farmers in the region reported similar incidents. Livestock disappearing without a trace, strange noises at night, that terrible smell, but nobody wanted to say what they really thought it might be. We all just sort of silently agreed not to talk about it too much. But we all knew something was out there that defied explanation. I've thought about selling the farm, especially after what happened. But this land has been in my family for 3 generations. Whatever that thing was, this is still my home. I've just learned to be more careful, to watch the tree line more closely, and to bring the sheep in well before dark. And I've learned something else too. Sometimes the old stories, the ones about things in the woods that don't quite fit into our normal world, Sometimes those stories exist for a reason. Story 18. We'd moved to Bear Lake in early spring of '83. I was 34 then. My wife Sarah was 32, and we had 2 kids, Tommy, 8, and Lisa, 6. The house was perfect for us. A 2-story colonial-style home sitting on 3 acres, backing right up to thousands of acres of dense forest. The price was surprisingly reasonable, which should have been our first warning sign, I guess. The realtor mentioned something about the previous owners moving out suddenly, but we were too excited about finally having our dream home to really think about that. The first few months were exactly what we'd hoped for. The kids loved exploring the massive backyard, though we had strict rules about not going into the forest, and Sarah started a vegetable garden. I was working from home as a freelance technical writer, which was pretty unusual back then, but it meant I could be there for the family. Everything was normal until that first moonless night in late August. I remember it clearly because earlier that day, I'd been complaining to Sarah about having to fix the porch light sensor. It kept turning on randomly during the day. Around 2:15 a.m., I woke up to what sounded like someone knocking on our bedroom wall. Not the normal random house settling sounds, but deliberate knocks. 3 slow knocks, pause, 2 quick ones, pause, then 3 slow ones again. Sarah woke up too, and we just laid there, barely breathing, listening. The knocking moved to different parts of the house, always following that same pattern. 3 slow, 2 quick, 3 slow. It wasn't loud enough to wake the kids, thank God, but it was clear as day to us. What really got to me was how high up some of the knocking was. Our bedroom was on the 2nd floor, and whatever was making that sound had to be at least 8 feet tall to reach where it was knocking. I did what any protective father would do. I grabbed the baseball bat from under our bed and went to check it out. Sarah begged me not to, but I had to know. The moment I opened our bedroom door, the knocking stopped. Complete silence. I checked every room, every window, walked the entire perimeter of the house with a flashlight. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing out of place. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was this smell. If you've ever been around roadkill that's been sitting in the sun for a few days, mixed with this weird, musky odor, that's what it was like. It was strongest near the kids' windows. The next morning, I would have written it off as some weird dream, except Sarah and I both had dark circles under our eyes from the sleepless night. We didn't talk about it much that day, but we both kept looking out the windows, checking the tree line. The kids were their usual energetic selves, completely oblivious to our unease. That evening, I noticed something that still makes me nauseous thinking about it. There were these smudges on the kids' windows, on the outside of the 2nd floor windows. When I looked closer, they were handprints, but not normal handprints. These were massive, easily twice the size of my hand, with fingers that seemed too long. I cleaned them off immediately, not wanting to frighten the kids or Sarah, but I took photos first with my old Polaroid. I still have them somewhere in the attic, though I haven't looked at them in years. The knocking continued every moonless night. Always the same pattern, always starting around 2 a.m. We started keeping the kids in our room on those nights, telling them it was for special family sleepovers. They thought it was fun. We were terrified. About 2 weeks after it started, things escalated. We began hearing what sounded like people talking in the woods behind our house. Not normal voices, though. It was like someone trying to mimic human speech, but not quite getting it right. The rhythm was wrong, the pitch was too deep, and it had this guttural quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The worst part was that it seemed like there were multiple voices calling to each other. One night, I got up the courage to record it on my old tape recorder. The quality was terrible, but you could clearly hear the vocalizations. I played it for our nearest neighbor, Bill Henderson, who lived about a half-mile down the road. His face went white. He'd been hearing the same things but thought he was imagining it. That's when he told me about the history of the area. Apparently, there had been similar reports dating back to the 1800s. Every few decades, families would report strange knocking, huge handprints, and those bizarre vocalizations. Most would move away within a year. The previous owners of our house had left in the middle of the night, leaving most of their furniture behind. Bill had assumed they'd had financial troubles, but now he wasn't so sure. The turning point came on a particularly cold September night. The knocking had just started, following its usual pattern, when we heard Lisa scream from her room. Sarah and I ran in to find her pointing at her window, crying hysterically. There, illuminated by the security light I'd installed, was a massive dark shape. I only saw it for a split second before it moved away, but what I saw will haunt me forever. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with arms that seemed too long for its body. But it was the eyes that got me. They reflected the light like a cat's eyes, but they were set in a face that was disturbingly close to human. Lisa was inconsolable. She kept saying, "The big man was looking at me." We moved all the kids' furniture into our room that night and called the police the next morning. The officer who came out was surprisingly understanding. He told us they'd had similar reports over the years, but could never find anything concrete. They did find footprints in the soft ground under Lisa's window, 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. They took plaster casts, but I never heard what came of them. The activity continued for another week, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. No more knocking, no more voices, no more handprints. The only evidence we had that it wasn't all some mass hallucination was the lingering smell that took months to fade from around the house, and the deep scratches we found on several trees at the edge of our property. Scratches that were nearly 8 feet off the ground. We ended up staying in that house for another 5 years. The incidents never returned, but we never felt completely safe there. The kids would never sleep in their own rooms again. We converted them to a home office and a playroom. Every time there was a moonless night, we'd all sleep in the living room, telling ourselves it was just for fun, but knowing it was really about fear. We finally moved away in 1988, but I still keep tabs on the area. Every few years, I hear rumors of similar incidents happening to other families in the Bear Lake region. Same pattern of knocking, same handprints, same voices in the woods. I've never gone public with this story before because, honestly, who would believe it? A family terrorized by what seemed to be multiple Bigfoot-like creatures that had enough intelligence to follow patterns and attempt human speech. But I know what we experienced. I know what I saw outside my daughter's window that night. And I know that somewhere in those Maine woods, there's something that's far more intelligent and organized than any animal, but definitely not human. Sometimes, on moonless nights, I still wake up at 2 a.m., half expecting to hear that familiar pattern of knocks. 3 slow, 2 quick, 3 slow. The thing that still bothers me the most? Those voices in the woods. They seemed to be getting better at mimicking human speech patterns as time went on, like they were learning. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, still learning, still watching. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder if they ever think about us too. Story 19. What happened to me and my buddies back in 2001 in Pinecrest, Arkansas, still gives me the creeps every time I think about it. I used to love night fishing. Honestly, some of my best memories were made during those quiet hours on the water. But after what we experienced over those 6 nights at Ferguson Lake, I haven't been able to look at wooded lakeshores the same way. I'm a construction worker from Little Rock, and every year since '95, me and 3 of my closest friends, Mike, Dave, and Tom, would take a week off in late October for our annual fishing trip. We'd been hearing about the catfish at Ferguson Lake, this really remote spot about 30 miles outside of Pinecrest. The lake itself isn't very big, maybe 3/4 of a mile across at its widest point, but it's deep and surrounded by dense pine forest. You have to drive about 5 miles down this worn-out dirt road just to reach it, and there's no cell service out there. Not that we had reliable phones back then anyway. We arrived on October 22nd, just as the sun was setting. The weather was unusually warm for October, around 65 degrees at night, with this weird, thick fog that would roll in over the water after dark. We set up our usual spot, this small clearing on the eastern shore where there's enough flat ground for our equipment and a couple of fold-out chairs. The nearest cabin or house was probably 4 or 5 miles away, minimum. That first night seemed normal enough. We got our lines in the water around 7 p.m., had our coolers full of beer and bait, and were settling in for what we hoped would be a productive night of fishing. The fish were biting well. We'd already caught 3 decent-sized catfish by 9 p.m. That's when Tom noticed something odd across the lake. At first he didn't say anything. I only found this out later. But he kept seeing movement along the tree line on the opposite shore. Not like deer or coyotes, which we were used to seeing. He described it as shadows that were too tall to make sense. When he finally mentioned it around 10 p.m., I remember laughing it off. Probably just the fog playing tricks on you, I said. But then Mike pointed to the same area, and we all saw it. This massive dark shape, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, moving between the trees. The weird thing was, there wasn't any noise. You'd expect something that big to make some sound, especially moving through underbrush, but it was dead silent. Even the usual night sounds, the frogs, crickets, owls, had gone quiet. That's when the smell hit us. I've been hunting all my life, and I've never smelled anything like it. It was this powerful, musty odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation, but much stronger. We stayed until about 2 a.m. that night, partly because the fishing was good, and partly because none of us wanted to admit we were spooked. We packed up our catch in the cooler, 6 nice catfish, and headed back to our motel in Pinecrest. The second night, we debated whether to try a different spot, but decided we were being ridiculous. This time, the shapes appeared earlier, around 8:30 p.m. There were definitely 2 of them, moving along the opposite shoreline. They seemed to be staying just at the edge of where our flashlight beams could reach. Every once in a while, we'd hear wood cracking, not like small branches, but like thick limbs being snapped. By the third night, they were bolder. They'd moved closer to the water's edge, and we could make out more details. The larger one had to be close to 9 feet tall, with massive shoulders. The fur looked dark, almost black in our flashlight beams. Sometimes we'd catch glimpses of eyes reflecting the light. They were set higher than any known animal in these woods. The fourth night is when things got really intense. We arrived to find obvious signs something had been through our spot. Our chairs, which we'd been leaving set up, were scattered about 20 feet from where we'd left them. Not knocked over, carefully moved. The ground around our usual sitting area was covered in huge footprints, easily 20 inches long. The stride length between them was massive, about 6 feet apart. We almost left right then, but something kept us there. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe we needed to prove to ourselves we weren't crazy. We set everything back up and started fishing. Around midnight, we heard splashing from the opposite shore. Through our flashlights, we could see one of them, the bigger one, actually wading in the shallows. The water would have been up to my chest, but it only reached its thighs. The fifth night, they came even closer. We could hear them moving in the woods behind us, just out of sight. The sounds of branches breaking seemed deliberate, like they were letting us know they were there. Every time we'd shine our lights toward the noise, they'd stop moving. The smell was overwhelming that night, so bad that Dave threw up at one point. Then came the last night. None of us really wanted to go back, but we had this unspoken need to see it through. Everything seemed quiet at first. too quiet. We'd caught 4 fish by midnight and stored them in our cooler as usual. Around 1 a.m., Tom needed to use the bathroom, so he walked about 50 yards down the shore, just past where our lights reached. He came running back less than a minute later, white as a sheet. He said he'd heard heavy breathing right behind him, and when he turned around, he was face to chest with something massive. He said he could feel the heat coming off its body. That was it. We started packing up immediately. As we were gathering our gear, we heard heavy footsteps approaching from both sides. The smell became overwhelming. In our panic to leave, Mike dropped his flashlight, and in the beam rolling on the ground, we could see these huge hair-covered legs moving just at the edge of the light. We grabbed what we could and ran to the truck. When we got back to the motel and checked what we'd managed to bring back, we made the creepiest discovery of all. The cooler had made it into the truck bed, but when we opened it, all the fish were gone. The ice was still there, neatly arranged like someone, or something, had carefully removed the fish and tried to put everything back exactly as they'd found it. We found more footprints the next morning when we went back for the rest of our gear. They were everywhere around our fishing spot, some of them 20 inches long and 8 inches wide, pressed deep into the mud. The strangest part was finding our chairs neatly stacked and our remaining gear carefully piled together, almost like they were left there for us to find. That was our last fishing trip to Ferguson Lake. We've tried to rationalize it over the years. Bears, maybe some kind of elaborate prank, but none of those explanations make sense. Bears don't stack chairs. Pranksters couldn't have made those footprints or reached that high into the trees where we found broken branches. I've never gone night fishing again. Tom moved to Arizona the following year, said he needed somewhere with fewer trees. Mike and Dave still fish, but only in populated areas, and never after dark. Sometimes I think about going back, just to see if they're still there, but then I remember the sound of those footsteps coming toward us in the dark, and that horrible, heavy breathing Tom described, and I know I never will. The weirdest thing? The following spring I read in the local paper that several hunters reported finding elaborate structures made of broken trees in that same area, and their game cameras kept getting turned around to face the trees. The rangers blamed it on vandals, but I know better. Whatever those things were, they're still out there, watching and waiting in the dark. Story 20. I'm a third-generation beekeeper. My grandfather started our apiary in Shadow Valley, Utah back in the 1940s, and I practically grew up among the hives. By '94, we had about 60 hives spread across our property at the edge of the Wasatch Mountains. It was good, honest work, and we knew every inch of our operation like the back of our hands. The trouble started in early May. I was doing my morning checks when I noticed something odd about hive number 23. The super, that's the box where bees store honey, was slightly askew, just a couple inches off-center. Now, this might not sound like much, but these boxes weigh around 90 pounds when full of honey, and they don't just shift on their own. Bears occasionally got into hives in our area, but this was different. There was no damage, no claw marks, nothing broken or destroyed. It was like someone had carefully lifted the super, taken what they wanted, and placed it back almost perfectly. I figured maybe some locals were stealing honey, though it seemed odd they'd be so careful about it. But then it happened again 2 nights later, this time to 3 different hives. Same thing, boxes slightly moved, honey partially removed, but everything handled with incredible precision. No broken frames, no damaged comb, no crushed bees. Whoever was doing this knew exactly what they were doing. The really weird part, our bees weren't agitated at all. Anyone who's worked with bees knows they get defensive when their hives are disturbed. They'll be angry for hours, sometimes days after someone messes with their home. But our bees were completely calm, like nothing had happened. After the 3rd incident, my dad and I decided to set up some trail cameras. We had 4 old Moultrie game cameras from deer hunting, and we positioned them around the most frequently targeted hives. The first few nights, nothing happened. Then, on May 12th, everything changed. I remember the date clearly because it was my youngest daughter's birthday. I went out early the next morning to check the cameras, and what I found, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. The first 3 cameras showed nothing unusual, but the 4th one, God, I can barely describe it. The timestamps showed 2:47 a.m. The first frame showed something massive moving between the hives. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, or maybe the camera malfunctioning, but then I saw it clearly in the next few frames. This figure had to be at least 9 feet tall. It was covered in dark, thick hair, but moved with an almost human-like precision. The way it handled the hive boxes, it wasn't just strong, it was careful, deliberate. In one frame, you could clearly see its massive hands gently lifting a super that would take 2 grown men to move. But what really got to me was how it accessed the honey. It wasn't just randomly grabbing and eating. It was methodically removing frames, one by one, carefully extracting honey without damaging the comb. The kind of skill that takes beekeepers years to develop. And the bees, in some of the frames you could see bees flying around it, but they weren't attacking. They were just letting it happen. I showed the photos to my dad that morning. He'd been keeping bees for 40 years at that point, and I'd never seen him speechless before. We sat at the kitchen table for what felt like hours, just staring at those grainy images. What do you even do with something like that? The visits continued for about 2 weeks. We started keeping better records. It would always come between 2 and 4 a.m., always on cooler nights, and always focused on the hives that had the most honey stored up. We could track its path through our apiary by which hives had been accessed each night. We thought about calling the authorities, but what would we say? That a giant hairy creature was carefully harvesting our honey in the middle of the night? That it somehow knew more about handling bees than most experienced beekeepers? We'd be laughed out of the county. One night, about a week after we got the photos, I decided to try to see it for myself. I set up in my truck about 400 yards from the apiary, using an old pair of night vision binoculars we had for predator hunting. Around 3 a.m., the temperature had dropped to about 45 degrees, and there was this weird stillness in the air. You know how sometimes it gets so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat? It was like that. Then I smelled it. Everyone talks about the smell, and they're right. It was this powerful, musky odor, like wet dog mixed with something else I couldn't identify. The bizarre thing was, it wasn't exactly unpleasant, just wild, ancient somehow. I heard it before I saw it. Not footsteps exactly, but this soft crunching of gravel and pine needles. Then it emerged from the tree line and, look, I've spent my whole life in these mountains. I've seen bears, mountain lions, all sorts of wildlife. This was different. The size alone was impossible, but it was the way it moved that really got to me. It was so purposeful, intelligent. Through the binoculars, I could see it clearly in the moonlight. The hair was a deep brown, almost black, and it had this massive barrel chest. But its hands, I'll never forget those hands. They were huge, but the way it used them to work the hives was almost delicate. It would lift a super like it weighed nothing, carefully remove frames, and somehow extract honey without breaking anything. I sat there for almost an hour, watching it work its way through our hives. It moved between them with this systematic precision, like it knew exactly which ones to target. At one point it stopped and turned in my direction. I swear it knew I was there, but it just kept working. Like it was telling me, I know you're watching, and I don't care. The whole time, our bees were completely calm. We had some aggressive hives that would attack at the slightest disturbance, but they just accepted this thing's presence. It was like they recognized it somehow. The last visit was on May 29th. We knew it was the last because it had this sense of finality to it. It worked through more hives than usual that night, and then, just like that, it was gone. We never saw it again, though sometimes early in the morning I still catch that distinctive smell on the wind. We lost about 20% of our honey production that spring, but honestly, that seemed like a small price to pay for what we witnessed. We still have the trail camera photos locked away in a safe deposit box. We've never shown them to anyone outside the family. Who would believe us? The really strange thing, that was one of our best years for honey production overall. The hives it visited actually seemed healthier somehow, with stronger colonies and better honey production through the summer. It's like whatever this thing was, it wasn't just taking from the hives, it understood them on some fundamental level we couldn't grasp. I still work those same hives today, though my dad passed a few years back. Sometimes when I'm out there early in the morning, checking the hives, I catch myself looking for signs of those careful, precise adjustments to the supers. Part of me hopes to see them again, to know that whatever that creature was, it's still out there, still practicing its own ancient form of beekeeping in the shadows of our mountains. But mostly, I'm left with questions that I'll probably never have answers to. How did it know so much about bees? Why did the bees accept it so readily? And what was it doing with all that honey? These questions have haunted me for 30 years now, and I suspect they always will. Every year in early May, I find myself spending a little extra time out by the hives at night, just listening and watching. The thing is, even with all the fear and uncertainty of that spring, there was something almost sacred about what we witnessed. Like we'd been given a glimpse of something that existed long before us and will continue long after we're gone. Something that understands more about these creatures we've spent generations working with than we ever will. Story 21. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but what happened on my farm in Oakwood, Missouri back in 2017 still keeps me up at night sometimes. I'm a third-generation farmer, been working these fields my whole life, just like my dad and granddad before me. We've got about 240 acres of corn, and I know every inch of that land like the back of my hand. What I witnessed that summer and fall, though, it changed everything I thought I knew about these fields. It started in late July. I remember the date exactly, July 24th, because I was doing my morning inspection of the fields, checking how close we were to harvest time. The corn was about 8 feet tall, and we were probably 2 or 3 weeks away from starting to bring it in. That's when I first noticed something wasn't right. There was this perfect circle in the middle of the eastern field, maybe about 30 feet in diameter. At first, I thought it might have been vandals, or maybe even one of those crop circle pranks you hear about. But when I got closer, I realized this was different. The stalks weren't broken or damaged like you'd expect if someone had stomped them down. No, every single plant in that circle had been picked clean. Just the ears of corn were gone, stalks still standing tall and healthy. The weird thing was, only the fully mature ears had been taken. The ones that needed another week or two were left untouched. I called the sheriff's office, but they just filed a report and suggested it might be teens or someone stealing crops. But I knew better. The precision of it all. No group of kids could have done this. Plus, the ground told a different story. There were these massive footprints sunk deep into the soil. Had to be at least 16 inches long and 7 inches wide. The impressions were so deep that whatever made them had to weigh hundreds of pounds. The next morning there was another circle, this time in the western field. Same perfect diameter, same selective harvesting, only the ripe ears taken. That's when I decided to start keeping watch. I set up a chair in my pickup truck at the edge of the field, armed with my old hunting rifle and a thermos of coffee. The first few nights, nothing happened. Just the usual nighttime sounds of crickets and the occasional coyote in the distance. But on July 30th, around 2:15 a.m., everything went dead silent. You know how the country gets quiet at night, but this was different. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the whole world. Even the crickets stopped chirping. The air got heavy, and this smell hit me, like wet dog mixed with something rotting. My truck's temperature gauge showed 68 degrees, but I started shivering like it was middle of winter. That's when I heard it, this deep rhythmic thumping coming from the north end of the field. Thump, 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 like heavy footsteps, but spaced way too far apart to be human. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my flashlight. I aimed it toward the sound, and I swear my heart nearly stopped. The beam caught something massive moving between the corn rows. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. The light only caught glimpses, dark, matted hair, muscular shoulders that seemed as wide as a car hood. It moved with this terrible purpose, like it knew exactly what it was doing. I watched, paralyzed, as this thing methodically worked its way through my corn, picking ears with these huge hands and what looked like some kind of crude bag made from woven corn stalks. The worst part was when it turned its head toward my truck. The light caught its face for just a second, dark eyes that reflected red in the beam, like a coyote's but bigger, set deep in a face that was somehow both ape-like and disturbingly human. I dropped the flashlight, and it rolled under my seat. By the time I fished it out, the thing was gone. But it left evidence. The next morning, I found another circle, and something new. These weird structures at the edge of the field. They looked like crude shelters made from expertly woven corn stalks, about 6 feet tall and 8 feet wide. The craftsmanship was incredible, with complex patterns I'd never seen before. Some of the stalks were twisted together so tight it took real effort to pull them apart. This pattern continued for weeks. Every few nights, a new circle would appear, always following the ripening pattern of the corn. It was like whatever this thing was, new farming. It never took ears that weren't ready. I found more footprints, deeper than before, and sometimes these 5-toed impressions in the mud by the creek that runs through my property. They were fresh enough that water was still seeping into them. I tried setting up game cameras, but they either malfunctioned or showed nothing but static when something should have been in frame. The few images I did get were just blurry shapes in the darkness. I've got one photo that might show something, a tall, dark figure standing at the field's edge, but it's so grainy, it could be anything. The structures got more elaborate too. By mid-August, there were 5 of them scattered around the property, each one more complex than the last. One morning, I found what looked like symbols woven into the corn stalks. Not any language I recognized, just these geometric patterns that seemed to mean something. The last encounter was the worst. It was September 12th, just as we were getting ready for the main harvest. I was doing a final check of the irrigation system around sunset when I heard something large moving through the corn behind me. The stalks parted, and there it was, not 30 yards away, standing in plain view. In the dying light I could see everything. It was covered in thick, dark brown hair, except for its face and palms. The face. God, the face. It was like looking at something that was almost human but just wrong enough to make your brain scream. Its eyes were deep-set and intelligent, focused right on me. It stood there, easily 8.5 feet tall, holding an ear of corn in one massive hand. For what felt like hours but must have been only seconds, we just stared at each other. Then it made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite speech, but something in between. The air filled with that awful smell again, and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I literally couldn't move. It took a step toward me, and that broke the spell. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, all the way back to my house. By the time I got my courage up to go back out with my rifle, It was gone. That was the last time I saw it. The circles stopped appearing after that, though I still find occasional footprints, especially after rain. The structures remained until winter came and the weather took them down. I've got photos of everything, the circles, the footprints, the structures, but they don't capture the scale of what I saw. Some mornings, I still find ears of corn placed on my front porch, only the ripe ones, cleaned as neatly as if they'd been processed by machine. I don't tell many people about this. Who'd believe me? But I know what I saw. Whatever it wasn't just some animal. It was intelligent, methodical, and it understood farming better than some humans I know. I still work my fields every day, but I don't stay out after dark anymore. Sometimes when the corn's high and the wind is right, I catch that smell again, or hear something moving through the rows that's way too big to be a deer. I've learned to just leave it be. This is its territory as much as mine now, I guess. The thing that really gets me, though, is the precision of it all. This wasn't just some creature raiding crops for food. It was harvesting, actually harvesting, with a knowledge of agriculture that shouldn't be possible. And those structures, I've had engineers look at them from photos, and they say the weaving patterns are incredibly sophisticated, using techniques that take humans years to master. I've thought about selling the farm, but this land's been in my family for generations. Plus, whatever this thing is, it hasn't actually hurt anyone or anything, just takes what it needs and leaves the rest. Sometimes I wonder if this is how farming first started, thousands of years ago. Some kind of cooperation between humans and something else. All I know is that my corn yields that year were actually better than average, despite what was taken. And the seeds from the ears that were left near the structures, they produced some of the healthiest corn I've ever grown. Make of that what you will. Story 22. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but what happened at our horse farm in Cedar Grove still keeps me up some nights, even after all these years. This was back in 2006, when my wife and I were running our small horse breeding operation. We had 8 horses at the time, beautiful quarter horses that we'd raised from foals. Everything was normal until that spring, when our horses started acting strange. It began with little things at first. Any horse owner will tell you that horses have distinct personalities and routines, and ours were no different. But around early April, they started behaving oddly during the night. I'd wake up to check on them. Our house sits about 200 feet from the stables, and find them all clustered in one corner of the paddock, not spooked exactly, but alert, awake, watching something. This went on for about 2 weeks before I really started getting concerned. The horses weren't scared, which was the weird part. Usually when coyotes or other predators are around, horses get skittish and nervous. But this was different. They seemed almost expectant, like they were waiting for something. My wife Sarah noticed they were more lethargic during the day too, like they weren't getting proper sleep at night. The breaking point came when our prize mare, Belle, started refusing to come into the stable for the night. She'd always been the easiest to handle, but suddenly she'd plant herself near the back fence and wouldn't budge. We'd have to literally coax her in with treats, which had never happened before. That's when I decided to install some security cameras. Nothing fancy, just 4 basic infrared cameras we got from the hardware store in Louisville. I set them up around the paddock, 1 pointing at the gate, 2 along the fence line, and 1 covering the back corner where the horses kept gathering. The first few nights showed nothing unusual. Just our horses, moving around more than they should at night, but nothing to explain their behavior. But then, on April 23rd, around 2:15 a.m., everything changed. I remember the date because it was my daughter's birthday, and I'd stayed up late finishing her birthday decorations. I was about to head to bed when I decided to check the camera feed one last time on my computer. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was someone, by the back fence. At first I thought it was a person, but the proportions were all wrong. This thing was huge. I'd estimate at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe taller. It was covered in what looked like dark, shaggy hair. The infrared made it hard to determine the exact color, but it appeared to be a uniform shade all over. But here's the part that really got to me. It was standing there, reaching over our 5-foot fence like it was nothing, and it was petting our horses. Belle and 2 others were crowded around it, completely calm, like this was normal, like they knew this visitor. My first instinct was to grab my shotgun and run out there, but something stopped me. The horses weren't panicked. They weren't in danger. They were actively seeking out this creature's attention. I sat there frozen, watching this absolutely surreal scene unfold on my monitor. The thing, and I know how this sounds, moved with an almost gentle deliberation. Its movements were smooth, not jerky or aggressive. It would reach out with these massive hands, I could make out distinct fingers, and run them along the horses' necks. Sometimes it would pick something off them, like it was grooming them. I must have watched for 20 minutes, barely breathing. Then it did something that made me question everything I thought I knew about wildlife. It reached into what looked like a crude pouch or fold in its hair fur and pulled out something. Even on the grainy footage, I could make out what appeared to be apples. It was feeding our horses apples. The whole encounter lasted about 45 minutes. Eventually, the creature simply turned and walked into the tree line behind our property. It moved with a smooth, rolling gait. Nothing like the awkward shuffle you see in those fake Bigfoot videos. This was something that was completely comfortable in its own body. The next morning, I went out to check the area. The ground was still soft from recent rain, and there they were, footprints, massive ones, about 16 inches long. I took photos and measurements, but honestly, I was more interested in checking on the horses. They were completely fine, better than fine, actually. They seemed more relaxed than they had been in weeks. Looking back at the camera footage during daylight hours made it even more bizarre. The creature's size became more apparent when compared to our fence posts, which I knew were exactly 5 feet high. Its shoulders were well above the fence line. But what struck me most was how deliberate and gentle its movements were. This wasn't some mindless animal. There was intelligence there. Over the next few months, we documented similar visits, always around 2 a.m., always with the same gentle interactions. The horses began to anticipate these visits. They'd gather at the back fence around the same time each night. We never approached during these encounters, partly out of fear, but mostly because we didn't want to disrupt whatever this peaceful interaction was. We did try to get better footage. I upgraded our cameras, set up additional lights, but somehow the footage always came out grainy or obscured. It's like the creature knew exactly where to stand to avoid clear documentation. The best shots we got were always partial. A massive arm here, a silhouette there. The visits continued regularly until late October, when they suddenly stopped. The horses seemed disappointed for a while, but eventually returned to their normal routines. We never saw the creature again, though sometimes on very quiet nights I swear I can hear heavy footsteps in the woods behind our property. I've gone back and forth about sharing this story for years. It sounds crazy. I know it does. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, hadn't watched it happen night after night, hadn't seen how our horses responded to it, I wouldn't believe it myself. We still have the footage, though it's not as clear as I'd like, and I've got dozens of plaster casts of those footprints stored in our barn. The thing that stays with me most isn't the size of the creature, or the mystery of what it was. It's the gentleness. Whatever this thing was, it showed more care and deliberation than most humans I know. It never spooked the horses, never acted aggressively, never tried to break into the stables or harm our animals. It just visited them, like they were old friends. I've heard other stories since then about similar encounters in Kentucky and the surrounding states. Some are clearly fake, but others, Others sound just like what we experienced. I don't know what to make of it all, honestly. I just know what I saw, what my cameras recorded, and how our horses behaved. Sometimes I still sit up late at night, watching our security cameras, hoping to catch another glimpse of our mysterious visitor. The horses don't gather at the back fence anymore, but every once in a while, they all look up at once, staring into the woods, ears forward, like they're listening for something. Or someone. Story 23. I've been a hunter in Vermont for most of my life, but what happened during that hunting trip in November 1989 still haunts me. I was out with my buddies Mike and Steve. We'd been hunting together for years in the Green Mountains around Riverside. It was supposed to be a routine 3-day hunting trip, nothing we hadn't done dozens of times before. November 12th started like any other hunting day. The temperature was around 35 degrees, and there was a light dusting of snow from the night before. Perfect tracking conditions. We'd set up our base camp about 7 miles from the nearest access road, deep in the national forest. The morning was dead quiet, that kind of stillness you only get when there's snow on the ground. We'd been tracking a small herd of deer since dawn, following their tracks through the dense forest. Around 10 a.m., Steve noticed something odd. A young maple sapling was bent over at about chest height, twisted in a way that didn't look natural. None of us thought much of it at first. Trees get damaged all the time from snow and wind. But then we spotted another one about 50 yards ahead, bent the exact same way. And another. They formed a clear line heading northeast. I've spent enough time in these woods to know that nature doesn't usually work that way. These weren't random breaks. Each sapling was deliberately twisted and pointed in the same direction. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Mike suggested we follow them, thinking maybe other hunters were marking a trail. I wasn't so sure, but curiosity got the better of us. We followed these markers for about half a mile. The spacing between them was too regular, too intentional. What really got to me was that some of these saplings were thick. You'd need serious strength to bend them like that. As we went deeper into the forest, the undergrowth got denser, and the towering old-growth trees blocked out most of the light. The temperature seemed to drop with every step. Then we found it. In a small clearing, maybe 40 feet across, we saw something I still can't properly explain. Young trees, dozens of them, had been woven together into what I can only describe as a massive dome-like structure. This wasn't something a person could easily make. The saplings were thoroughly intertwined, some still alive and growing, others stripped of bark. The structure was about 12 feet high at its center and roughly 20 feet across. The level of complexity was mind-boggling. Branches were wrapped and twisted together in patterns that would have taken incredible strength and reach to accomplish. The ground inside and around the structure was oddly clear of snow, and the earth was compressed like it had been repeatedly walked on. We found odd impressions in the soil, not quite footprints, but long, deep depressions that didn't match any animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were huge, maybe 16 inches long, and showed what looked like toe marks at one end. That's when we noticed the smell. Anyone who's spent time outdoors knows the usual forest smells: decomposing leaves, damp earth, occasional animal musk. This was different. It was a heavy, pungent odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting meat and something else I can't even describe. It wasn't just unpleasant. It triggered something primitive in my brain that screamed, danger. We decided to set up our camp about a quarter-mile away from the structure. Looking back, that was probably our biggest mistake. As dusk approached, the woods got eerily quiet. You know how the forest usually has a background noise of birds, squirrels, and wind in the trees? All of that just stopped. The silence was absolute, and it felt wrong. Around 8:30 p.m., while we were sitting around our small campfire, we heard it. A long, low vocalization that started like a deep growl, but transformed into something that sounded almost like speech, but not quite. It came from the direction of the structure. Before we could even process what we'd heard, another call answered from somewhere to our right, maybe 200 yards away. Then a third response came from behind us. These weren't wolf howls or coyote calls. I know those sounds. These vocalizations had complexity to them, almost like they were communicating specific information. They went back and forth for about 20 minutes, getting closer. We could hear heavy footsteps in the forest around us, branches snapping under significant weight. The fear we felt wasn't the normal anxiety you might get from being in the woods at night. This was primal terror. We were being surrounded by something intelligent, something that was coordinating its movements. I remember Steve reaching for his rifle, hands shaking so bad he could barely hold it. That's when we saw the first one. Just at the edge of our firelight, a massive dark figure moved between two trees. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a bulk that made it look twice as wide as a large man. The thing moved with an unnatural smoothness for its size, almost gliding between the trees. The fire reflected off its eyes. They glowed a deep amber color. We could hear the others moving around us just out of sight. The sounds they made were getting closer, and the smell, that awful, musky odor, was overwhelming. Mike suggested making a run for it, but we all knew that was suicide. Whatever these things were, they knew these woods better than we did, and they were faster than us. For what felt like hours, we sat there, barely breathing, while these creatures moved around our camp. They never came into the full light, but we could see their silhouettes, their massive forms blocking out the stars as they moved. The vocalizations continued, softer now, like they were talking to each other just above a whisper. Around 3 a.m., something changed. The creatures started moving away, their footsteps and calls becoming more distant. By dawn, they were gone, leaving only their twisted tree markers and that bizarre structure as evidence they were ever there. We packed up and got out of those woods as fast as we could. The walk back to our truck was tense. We kept looking over our shoulders, jumping at every sound. The forest had returned to normal, birds singing, squirrels chattering, but it felt different now. Like we'd glimpsed something we weren't supposed to see, something that fundamentally changed how we viewed these woods. I've never gone back to that specific area, and neither have Mike or Steve. We've tried to rationalize what we saw: bears, other hunters playing tricks, our imaginations getting the better of us. But we all know what we experienced. Those weren't bears making those structures or communicating like that. The intelligence behind it, the coordination of their movements, the deliberate way they surrounded us but didn't attack. It was all too purposeful. I still hunt, but never alone, and never in that part of the forest. Sometimes at night, I still hear those vocalizations in my dreams, those complex, almost human sounds that definitely weren't human at all. The thing that haunts me most isn't just what we saw that night. It's the realization that these creatures had probably been watching us long before we noticed any signs of them. How many times had we been in those woods, thinking we were alone, when we weren't alone at all? The markers, the structure, the coordinated movements, it all suggested an intelligence we're not comfortable acknowledging exists in our forests. These weren't mindless beasts. They were something else entirely. Something that's managed to stay hidden despite all our technology and development. Something that's probably still out there, watching and waiting. I've never filed an official report about what happened. Who would believe it? But I know what I saw, what we all saw. Those woods hold secrets, and maybe they're secrets we're not meant to understand. All I know is that every time I hear about another strange sighting in those mountains, about weird structures found in the forest or mysterious sounds in the night, I remember that November evening and those amber eyes reflecting our firelight.